This place was clearly similar to the dungeon in its make, and whatever the system had done here was basically the same, albeit a lot larger. There really had been a lot put into the development of the Circle Lords. Perhaps there was an opposing place to this that the gods used to train. Jonathan doubted that there were any tier 100 simply wandering around Telvaria other than the gods themselves. The system was certainly capable of creating such a thing, however. As far as Jonathan could tell, it was more powerful than even the gods themselves. It could reach across multiple different layers of reality, and dictated the growth of untold numbers of people. That was a step above what the gods had shown thus far. They were likely just beings that had reached the top of this universe. In any case, he was probably beyond their reach now, and was safe. The only thing left watching him was the system. He had been waiting with bated breath for it to attack him again, but it seemed to have either given up on getting rid of him, or it was biding its time for the most opportune time to strike. It probably saw him as a threat, but one that wasn't worth losing any sleep over. He shook his head to clear the useless thoughts and started down the stairs. They had a world to discover. This telescope would be useful in finding out more about the various landmarks of Tartarus. Then something happened that Jonathan had been dreading, but still prepared for. On his faction interface, the number went down. It was only by 1, but a moment later, it decreased again. Shit! Jonathan shouted, and pulled out the token. Someone is attacking the city. Edgar grabbed the token a moment later, and they teleported back to the cave. Jonathan rushed out, only to see a large section of the wall in ruins, and a small party of high-leveled fighters bullying their way through the paltry defenses. Bodies were sent flying like ragdolls, and blasts of energy leveled houses. Edgar gathered the wind around himself and Jonathan, carrying them down towards the ground. They moved a bit too slowly for Jonathan's taste, however, and he banished the energy with his void power, falling the rest of the way. When he hit the ground, he ran as fast as he could, his body streaking across the ground like a bolt of lightning. He reached the breach in the wall a moment later, and slammed his fist into the nearest fighter, an armored man wielding a mace. His strike was imbued with as much power as he could pack into it, and the fighter was basically atomized as it landed, shards of metal and bone shooting everywhere. The others paused upon this, and turned to face Jonathan, brandishing their weapons. One of them stepped forwards, and took off his helmet. He was an older elven man, with gray hair. However, he was still youthful in all other aspects of his appearance. Jonathan Harlow. We finally meet. I am Yalton Barovoid, loyal servant of Granath. You have evaded his justice for far too long. The man had a large broadsword strapped to his back, and he quickly drew it as he spoke. The weapon was beautiful, made out of a core of silvery metal and a body of dark iron. It glowed with a faint internal light, as if it was enchanted. The man plunged the weapon into the ground and watched Jonathan, before snapping his fingers. His soldiers, about 5 in number, charged Jonathan, roaring in rage. As they came in, Jonathan got a better gauge of their strength. They were all undoubtedly tier 2, but lower tier 2 in strength, about level 110 to 120. They were all weaker than he was without a shadow of a doubt. Yalton, however, felt a lot more powerful than his soldiers. Jonathan would have to be wary. Edgar arrived a moment later, casting his buffs on both of them. A spear of energy lanced down a moment later, taking one of the fighters in the neck and almost skewering them. Only their armor saved them from the impact, and they were tossed into a nearby wall, leaving Jonathan with one less to deal with. Then the battle was on. He grabbed the first blow with his gauntlets, wincing as the metal whined upon sliding against the other fighter's axe. He pushed the weapon aside and sent a devastating punch straight into the fighter's stomach, imbuing it with his stamina. The punch accelerated like a rocket, and when it struck, bones fractured and organs ruptured. The fighter was knocked into the air and backwards a few dozen feet, where they fell, gasping onto the ground. Yalton sighed and raised one hand, creating an orb of greenish energy that began to heal his soldiers. It did nothing for Jonathan and Edgar save for being a bright nuisance on the field of battle. Jonathan snarled as he saw his work being undone, and decided to take the fight straight to the boss himself. He sent stamina to his legs, and pushed off, almost teleporting towards Yalton. The man tracked his movement however, as he approached, Yalton whipped his sword out of the ground and met the strike with his own. The attack was simple, but somehow filled with complexity. The only possible explanation was that Yalton was far more skilled with his weapon than Jonathan was. The blade almost seemed to vibrate in the air, causing it to be in multiple places at once. Jonathan was forced to parry with his entire arm, causing the attack to burrow into his armor. His newly enhanced armor held, but barely, and Yalton projected energy into the sword, causing a caustic green mist to spill out of the blade. Where it touched his skin, it started to bulge and grow uncontrollably, crushing itself against the metal of his armor. It was agonizing, and Jonathan screamed in pain. He drove his other fist into Yalton's jaw, and succeeded in staggering the man. He drew his other hand back and pulsed the void through it, getting rid of the foul effects of whatever skill Yalton had used. Many think of the element of life as an endless wellspring of beneficence, but it is anything but that. On the other side of the coin is cancer, unchecked growth that ends with the extinguishing of life. Many underestimate my chosen element. They have paid the price, Yalton said, a strange aura of reverence filling his voice. All around, the other fighters circled, but Jonathan ignored them. Edgar had his back. You wish to speak about elemental power? To me? I will show you true potency, Jonathan replied. He had noticed that he had a tendency to become a bit pretentious in the middle of battle, but it was a trait that would serve him well. The energy of the void sprang to his fists, causing them to glow with purple light. To punctuate the point, he summoned more and more, until his fists were covered in purple energy. Drawing the conceptual meaning of his elemental energy, leaning upon the teachings of his hungering decay skill, he summoned more void energy than he had ever before. Yalton grimaced and raised his sword, blocking the strike. A hammer blow of purple energy crashed into the blade, slamming it back into Yalton's face. The energy almost seemed to eat away at reality around it, the hallmark of the void. The man recovered incredibly quickly however, and before Jonathan could land another blow, the man's hand snaked out and grabbed his foot out of the air, before throwing him upwards. The sword came hissing toward his abdomen, and he hurriedly blocked it with his gauntlets. Void light fought with life light, and the two energies sizzled in the air as they fought to erase one another. Yalton had a much higher level of mastery, but the void was meant for things like this. Eventually, both attacks fizzled out, just as Jonathan landed on the street, ready for battle. Yalton seemed shocked that his attack had failed, and he paused for a moment, before snapping his fingers. A corona of green light rose up around him, and his armor started to creak as he grew in size. The plates bulged outwards, and separated, revealing a massive hulk of swollen muscle underneath. It seemed that Yalton could control the progression of his elemental ability somewhat. With a deep roar, the man raised his sword above his head and brought it sweeping down. The blade seemed to grow longer and longer in Jonathan's sight, until it blocked out everything else. He knew that it was only an illusion, but he had no doubts about what would happen to him if he let that strike land. Jonathan gathered up his power in his right fist and struck, layering his stamina, mana and elemental energy into one colossal punch. Adding on the energy of his mythical skill created a field of nothingness above his fist that hissed through the air as he punched. Yalton screamed as he brought the attack crashing down, and the air around him seemed to turn green as his aura spread out into the world. Jonathan unleashed his own aura, creating a purple sphere of power that crashed into the other fighter's aura. At this point, the weaker servants of Granath were engaged with Edgar on the other side of the street, wisely staying away from the clash of titans that was occurring between Jonathan and Yalton. A moment later, the two strikes collided, and there was a brief moment of silence before the roiling energies detonated. Green light burst into the world, ripping through the air and creating strange growths when it hit bacteria and even small insects, turning them into writhing mounds of flesh. The erasing power of the void spread out in a shockwave from Jonathan, destroying the abominations as they spread. Most of the energy was directed at the two men however, and as his fist slipped past Yalton's strike and into the man's gut, the sword came crashing down on Jonathan's shoulder, turning it into a loose bag of bone shards. It was a miracle that it was not severed entirely, but most of the energy was already spent. Jonathan added another charge of stamina to his attack, almost tapping his reserves. With a whoosh, the strike slammed into Yalton's stomach. The armor bent around the strike, and Jonathan heard bones breaking and flesh being pulverized under his blow. Yalton coughed up blood, and reverted to his normal state, whatever skill he had been using wearing off as the damage was dealt. Jonathan was blasted off his feet by the momentum of Yalton's strike, and he rolled across the ground, groaning in pain. His arm was in ruins, and it was completely useless. Such an injury would take hours to fully heal. He was down to his one arm, which would have to be enough. The pain from his shattered arm was intense, but he managed to compartmentalize it. On Earth, he would have blacked out from the pain, but he was made of sterner stuff here. Tempered by battle, and by his levels, he was resilient to almost all pain. Besides, fighting for one's life was a great incentive to keep moving despite agony. Yalton was retching up blood a few dozen feet away, already trying to heal his injuries. Jonathan could not have that. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the townspeople fleeing up the mountain, towards the cave. He let out a sigh of relief at this. Even the guards, with their boosted levels, would die in seconds before Yalton and his compatriots. Jonathan shakily got to his feet and started running, using his stamina to boost himself. His regeneration rate was enough to keep him going, and it only dipped when he used his skill. Yalton laid one of his hands on his ruined stomach, wincing as the greenish light of his elemental energy played across his armor. The skin started to knit back together, but before it could heal fully, Jonathan came charging in, his fist catching the other man under the chin. Bones cracked, even with the armor, and Yalton was blasted backwards, his skill cutting out. Jonathan screamed as his broken arm was jostled by the strike, but he turned the pain into rage, and kept going, battering the other man into the ground. Yalton started to channel life energy into his hands, pouring it into Jonathan. As his skin burst apart under the pressure, he kept punching, battering Yalton into a pulp. A few moments later, the man breathed his last, and a tide of essence entered Jonathan, carrying him up 2 levels. The world started to spin around him, and he collapsed, briefly hoping that Edgar was strong enough to defeat the other fighters. As Jonathan collapsed, Edgar snarled. He was in a tough spot. The other fighters were luckily all melee fighters, but they were still hard to deal with. All of them were higher level than he was, and only his higher level of skill was able to narrow the gap. His potent elemental abilities had dealt with one of the other fighters already, but the rest were proving difficult to harm. Their armor, a seeming mainstay among the forces of Granath, was too tough for his strikes to deal with, unless he spent time gathering enough energy to make them count. However, that would require him to stop, and against enemies that were much faster than him, that was suicide. Instead, he would have to make this a war of attrition, fighting for every advantage that he could get. Eventually he found an opening and sent in a conceptually enhanced bolt of wind, lifting one of the fighters off their feet. A series of spears of wind hammered into the man, killing him. With a grin, Edgar kept moving, using the air to keep his speed up. Jonathan had already dealt with the leader. It was up to him to prove his worth. There were only 3 fighters left, all of whom seemed to be perturbed by the death of their leader. Perhaps if Edgar instilled enough fear into them, he could force them to leave. His outward appearance might have seemed to be unperturbed, but his mana was beginning to run out, as well as his elemental energy stores. The decline of a mage was purely internal, and it was hard to tell when one was losing their grip on their mana. However, Edgar refused to fail here. With a roar, he started to spray powerful spells in every direction, acting as if he was only getting warmed up. As they struck his enemies, he achieved his goal. One of them cursed and started to run, quickly followed by the others. Edgar hovered in the air for a few moments, making sure that they were gone, and then fell to the ground, panting. Both men were entirely spent, but the city was safe, for now. Jonathan awoke with a searing pain in his left arm, and a dull headache thumping behind his forehead. The headache was likely from the resources that his body was using to heal his tremendously damaged shoulder, which were quite costly to maintain. If not for the fact that he had been sleeping, it would have taken a lot longer to heal. Even now it was still tender and raw, and he knew that he would be better off not fighting with it for at least another day. Yalton had been incredibly powerful, and that battle could have gone either way. Speaking of the man, his corpse lay by Jonathan, with all of his belongings still there. The sword that he had used to great effect was strewn across the ground, untouched. Jonathan hesitantly got to his feet and walked over to the sword, before analyzing it. Alacrithes. Tier 2 weapon, bladed. The ancestral blade of the Barovoid family, this blade has been wielded by their scions for generations in the service of Granath. Made from a pattern only known to the Barovoids, a great clan back in the realm of Telvaria, it boasts heightened power compared to most other weapons of its rank, as well as the ability to easily channel the ancestral elements of the clan, that of life. With a name that means blooming rose in the ancient language of the elves, a tongue not often spoken, it is much more deadly than that name suggests. Plus 12 to strength, plus 12 to dexterity, plus 6 to resilience while wielding. It gave the same stat boosts as his weapon gave, but the description was very different. It was mostly useless to him, however, given that he was not a swordsman, nor did he use the element of life. He would give it to the city to deal with. However, there were a few more pressing matters. You have reached journeyman rank 1 with martial arts. You have long since surpassed the mortal limits of this skill, finding deeper truths about yourself and your martial path in the practicing of your preferred method of combat. When it comes to martial arts, you are a prodigy of the highest order, able to weave together the techniques of yesterday with the attacks of tomorrow. Plus 15 to strength, plus 10 to dexterity. You have access to a new skill. Fists of the Hurricane, Epic. Your prodigious strength and speed allow you to move in ways that force the world around you to bend to your will. Taking a step upon this path will allow you to bend the very air around you with your strength, creating powerful gusts of wind that unbalance weaker enemies. Accept. Y/N. Jonathan accepted without a second thought, entranced by the description. Immediately he felt new information enter his mind, allowing him to find the most effective way to leverage his strength. He punched forwards, and held his fist in such a way that it hit the maximum amount of air. A small gust shot forwards, rattling the rocks on the street. It was weak for now, but it would grow with time. Another notification waited, this one for his Flowing Hurricane skill. You have reached journeyman rank 1 with Flowing Hurricane. With your advances in strength and speed since you first learned this skill, you have reached a greater degree of mastery than would have been possible for the Jonathan of even a few weeks prior. You can blend your attacks together, creating an implacable net of strikes that even the most stalwart of foes can fall to. Plus 15 to dexterity, plus 10 to strength. Jonathan smiled and closed the notification, only then noticing that Edgar was lying on the ground a few dozen feet away, seemingly resting. Jonathan made his way over to the man, wincing as his injuries twinged, and sat down. That was certainly an interesting battle, Jonathan said. Interesting, but not very fun. I almost depleted my entire mana stock. All 7,500 plus points of it. Yeah, that sounds rough. At least your shoulder wasn't reduced to splinters, Jonathan replied, grinning half-heartedly. That Barovoid bastard was no joke. Edgar merely nodded in reply, staring up at the sky. There would undoubtedly be more fighters coming, and they would need to train up all of the citizens to be able to fight. Even a dozen or so Tier 2 guards would be enough to guard the city against most threats. Although it might seem that Granath commanded the loyalty of legions of Tier 2s, there weren't actually that many in this realm. Many were bottlenecked by the ambient mana and died before their time, and those that survived were hard-pressed to gain levels. However, out here in the untamed ash, there were plenty of opportunities to gain levels, and at a rapid rate at that. The presence of Jonathan and Edgar were key though, as they were able to keep the soldiers safe for long enough that they could actually benefit from the levels. A lot of things were going to have to change around here if they were to keep their people safe. Granath raged within his throne room, in an apoplectic fury from the never-ending litany of losses that he was suffering to that accursed Jonathan Harlow. This man was rapidly eclipsing the path of the hero all those millennia ago, and at this rate, he might be even able to achieve that no other man had ever done. To kill a Circle Lord. Even worse, it seemed that Angranor was getting involved. Yalton had not reported the presence of Jonathan until a few minutes after his platoon had arrived, meaning that he was in an alternate dimensional space. The only one that Granath knew of like that was Tartarus, and only Angranor could grant access. The Lord of Hell was playing games with his toys, and Granath did not like that one bit. Granath suddenly found himself overcome by pure anger, and thrashed around for a moment in his throne room. It did little for him, but it made him feel marginally better. He had just reminded himself of his strength and power, and he had managed to convince himself somewhat about his ability to defeat Jonathan, should he even reach the necessary level of power to fight him. Granath had been on the top of this realm for eons because of his strength, and that was not going to suddenly end just because of some upstart who had a modicum of talent. The only problem was the lower mana density of this world, which had been a thorn in his side ever since reaching the peak of Tier 2. The demerit to power was only supposed to be about 50% at its maximum amount, but for a being of his caliber, it was even more, as his body was supported by his levels and skills. Otherwise he would not be able to even move, what with his massive body. Monsters beyond a certain size thrived off of mana and system-granted strength, which meant that they were basically impotent without them. With a 50% decrease in his stats, he would see a far larger demerit to his physical abilities. Not that he really needed them, as he was a mage of the highest level, at least within Tier 2, but it helped to be able to hold his own. If not for his high levels of defense, that hero would have cut him in half long ago, spelling his end. Seeing as Jonathan followed a martial path, he would have to be able to react to his movements. Even when the man had been a Tier 1, with all of his abilities engaged he had been fast enough to evade his strikes, something that should have been impossible. At his current power, perhaps he was already a physical match for him. In addition, Jonathan's special divinity-related skill allowed him to resist soul damage, which rendered Granath's most iconic technique moot. However, Granath had a host of other magical abilities. He was an elementalist of great skill and power, and when he really got moving, he could destroy mountains with his spells. As Granath calmed himself by reliving his greatest moments, he slowly got control of his raging emotions once more. Jonathan was proving to be a nuisance, but not one that would be much of a threat, as long as he was dealt with quickly. It was time to stop playing around. He knew where the man was located now, and he would send an entire legion after him. Let Jonathan deal with the combined forces of hundreds of thousands of warriors. He would die before long. Back in the Rim. A few weeks later, the city had its first newly minted Tier 2. Eva had been able to finally reach that vaunted level, after hundreds of life-threatening battles. Jonathan and Edgar had not been slacking off either, and although neither had focused on their growth too much, they had reached the low 120s in level, with the aid of Tartarus. Jonathan had neglected his skills in favor of his city, but most of them were still hovering on the cusp of journeyman rank, or had already passed it. For Jonathan, the growth in power was enough to deal with the repression of the lower mana density, but he would eventually need to find a solution. He had been too busy to justify experimenting with his runes, but he would do so when he was free. The average level of the guards had skyrocketed as well, with most of them in the 80s. A large portion of the townspeople had shown interest in leveling as well, and quite a few now however around level 50. With Eva's presence, they could run more leveling missions than before, which increased the overall efficiency. More and more people had flocked to his banner over that time, and the city was now almost 5,000 strong. There were a lot of people in this realm, for its size at least, and enough of them were sufficiently enthused with his strength to join Jonathan's mission. He had continued to study the book in the meantime, and had found out some interesting facts about the later circles of the hells. Although the number of people in them was fewer, that only counted those who were at the actual level of that realm. Children were not born at the tier of their parents, and in the eons that the hells had been around, there was ample opportunity to create progeny. Because of the sheer size of the later realms, there were far more people there than Jonathan could have ever imagined. In addition, the powerful craved the attention of the weak, which meant that this process was encouraged. The book had waxed lyrical about the illustrious nature of the Church of Redeeming Light as well, which Jonathan had mostly glossed over. That had been expected though, given the author's position. More importantly, Jonathan had learned of Granath's powers and skills. The Circle Lord specialized in the four natural elements, as the book had referred to them, those of fire, water, earth and air. There were three other spheres of elemental power as well. The conceptual sphere of light, dark, life and death, the ethereal sphere of time, fate and the primal sphere of order and chaos. The position on a sphere did not have much of an effect on the overall power of that element, but more on its complexity. Chaos was considered to be the first element, and the most complicated to use. The book had not mentioned the void, rather alluding to a force that it called quintessence, which was described as the natural desire for existence to revert to nothingness. It served as a sort of fifth sphere to balance out the others. It was similar to the ideas on earth of the ancient Greeks about the separation between the earth and the heavens, with the quintessence of the natural elements, and the fifth element of quintessence, which was an immutable, heavenly power that made up the realm of the gods. In any case, that was mostly just academic conjecture, and the real worth of the book was in its description of Jonathan's enemies. Granath was able to summon highly advanced manifestations of those elements, creating spell constructs that would be able to destroy villages in a single hit. The worm had likely been holding back when Jonathan had fled from him, so as to not destroy his city. In those few minutes, the worm would have easily been capable of taking out great swathes of his capital. He had seen a small fraction of the man's power during the fight back in the Ashen Citadel, if it could even be called such a thing. It had been more like a fighting retreat. Granath was weaker than him in physical combat, or at least he would be once Jonathan reached his level, but none of that mattered if he was swatted out of the air like a bug as soon as he got near the monster. His void energy abilities would help in trying to unbind the spells that the monster used, but so far, none of them were powerful enough to fully take out a skill from the Circle Lord. Although his Touch of Decay skill had morphed into Hungering Decay, he was still capable of using it in its original form, to unbind spells. However, if he was able to find a way to extend the pure destructive force that was within his upgraded skill version, and add it to the weaker skill, it would serve him well in terms of being able to unbind attacks. That would be something to practice over the next while. He knew that the soldiers of Granath were likely coming toward him, and although it had been a few weeks, if they were moving in any sort of force, it would take them longer to get here. At least there were fewer Tier 2s than Tier 1s by quite a large margin, and there wouldn't be thousands of Tier 2s coming towards the town at this moment. Jonathan could deal with a lot of Tier 1s on his own, and if he played his cards right in terms of leveling up the soldiers, they could deal with a lot more. Jonathan was waiting in his cave, perusing the notebook, but he eventually stood, and headed out. The city was rapidly growing beneath him, and it had started to expand upwards as well as outwards. There were two wall sectors now, with the second, and larger, one about a mile out from the interior wall, which had been repurposed into a dwelling space. With the surging levels of the citizens, making such a wall had been child's play, and the construction within was going at a similarly quick pace. The noises of construction were loud, even from here, and the newer members of the faction were hard at work showing that they deserved to be here. Further down the mountain, construction had begun on a shelter for the eventuality of an assault, where the weaker citizens could flee. It had been dug into the mountain, with a large stone door that could be slid in front of the entrance to stop any attack. It extended down for quite some distance, and was loaded up with enough food and supplies for weeks, which wasn't all that much, considering that higher-level people didn't have to eat as much. In any case, Jonathan had begun to draw together a city defense plan with Edgar and the council members, and they had managed to conscript more fighters to join the guards than they had expected. The total number of guards now was almost 500, but that was boosted a lot by the promise of free leveling from Jonathan and Edgar. The potential to reach a level previously only dreamed of was quite the temptation. However, there were still a majority that had come here to escape the horrors of the world, rather than relive them. The city needed people with other vocational skills anyway, not just fighters, and it was doing well for that. Woodworkers, stone carvers, all manner of useful and talented craftsmen were flocking here. They were all still quite low level, as a life of crafting relied more on pathway skills than levels, but they were still good at their jobs. Stats had little impact on their abilities to work, unless it was with high-tier materials, something that was not really a problem in such a weak realm. Although the ash heaps might have seemed powerful to a level 10, they were the very weakest of the hell circles. The references to the power of beings in the higher realms within the diary were limited, but from what Jonathan could tell, even the 10th realm was powerful beyond anything he had seen before. The book spoke of flying cities and beings with the strength to crush countries with a single punch. It was not out of reach for Jonathan to understand, but seeing as there were still another 90 tiers after that one, it was mind-boggling. He would be in for a tough time as he ascended the plains, or rather descended. Perhaps it did not even matter. There were no real relations in space between the hell circles. They were more like self-contained realms that were causally linked. One could not ascend or descend to the next one by simply traveling down into the earth or up into the sky. There was a host of other bits of information about the hells that Jonathan had begun to note down, seeing the book presented them in a rather long-winded manner. He absently pulled out the notes, which were affixed to the book, as he walked. Circles layout. 9 realms of hell, each with 11 circles. Seems to be modeled after the 7 deadly sins, with 2 more added on. The current realm is that of sloth, which fits with the whole desolation theme that the ash heaps has going on. The final circle of hell is separate from all the others. It's where Angranor dwells, and although it is nominally part of the 9th realm, it is much harder to get to. Each circle is meant for a specific tier, going up by 1 each time to a maximum of tier 100. Circle Lords. Each circle is ruled by the most powerful being in that circle, generally considered to be an undefeatable opponent. They are always at the peak of what their realm can support. A motley crew of monsters and humanoids, with a diverse array of power sets. All of them serve under Angranor, and there is some sort of hierarchy to them called the Infernal Court. Not explained well by the book. Power levels. Each circle of hell is 1 tier higher than the previous one, both in terms of mana density and in terms of the souls that are sent there. However, there is no lower limit on the tier of the inhabitants. Looks like even tier 10s need some servants to do their dirty work for them. The circle lords are always just below the maximum level for the tier of the realm, and in most realms, there is no mana inhibition like there is here. The reason for this is that the ash heaps needed a tier 2 ruler, as there is too little available strength in tier 1 to cement Granath's rule, no matter how talented he was. In the later circles, there is no demerit to power like there is here. Good for me, but also means that the circle lords can pursue me. The rest of the information that he had gotten was less essential, and he had trusted it to his memory rather than writing it down. There was a lot of useful information in the book, but it was sometimes hard to get to, seeing as it was usually referenced in a random section rather than there being an entire chapter on the subject. For example, the information about the elements had been spread across much of the first section of the book, with Jonathan having to piece it together. However, it was now cemented in his mind, and he checked it one more time. His own interpretation of it was less precise than the actual wording. On the elements. The backbone of the cosmos, upon which all things rest, are the 12 elements, the primal building blocks of everything. Taking up the aspect of many diverse parts of creation, they are what renders the physical world possible. Fire, the spark that tore the universe out of an inert, lifeless state. Earth, the solidity that built the various worlds of Telvaria. Water, the willingness for change that was required to make sure that life could continue. Air, the ideal of freedom and unfettered desire that brought the flighty emotions of gods and mortals alike into existence. Those four make up the natural sphere, the basest of the elements. On the next level are the conceptual sphere of elements. Light, the beacon of hope in the darkness, and the power behind the universe. Dark, the absence of light, but also the presence of the more shadowy aspects of the universe, those that all would rather remain hidden. Life, the element that sustains the myriads of beings in this universe. Death, the natural leveler of all, that force that will claim even the gods one day. After those are the ethereal elements. Time, the construct that exists both in the minds of mortals and in the wider universe. Fate, the divine engine that keeps time's entropic grasp in check. Finally, the first elements, those of the primal sphere. Order, the desire of all things to be in perfect alignment. Chaos, the desire of all things to be opposed to one another. These elements all exist in harmony, with each pair balancing the other. Water curbs fire's desire to consume all in its rampant heat. Life ensures that all does not fall into the embrace of death. Because of these balances, creation keeps on running. However, there is another element, one only whispered about. That of the quintessence, the natural desire of existence to revert to nothingness. It serves as a final sphere of sorts, but one that cannot be easily detected. For how can one detect the absence of existence, the cessation of all that renders such a search even possible? Only through obtuse gleanings from arcane studies, or through the perusal of ancient artifacts do we even know of its existence. It was a bit long-winded, but quite poetic in its wording. Jonathan would have enjoyed it more if it had been all in one place, but he could hardly complain. As he headed down the side of the mountain, he sped up a little bit, spotting a returning expedition coming in from the outer ash. It was led by Eva and Edgar, who had both been quite involved in the cementing of their relationship. Jonathan was happy for his companion, but he hoped that this would not prevent him from coming with him to the later hells. If all things went well, however, Eva would gain enough power to come with them. This journey would always be something greater than just one man, and perhaps Jonathan would pick up a host of allies as he went. However, Edgar would always be the first. Eva had gained a powerful class upon reaching Tier 2, an epic one in fact, and she was gaining strength at a decent rate, enough to make her valuable to the city. Most people only ever got common or uncommon classes, with a small hope for rare. For her to get an epic one meant that she was quite talented indeed. Perhaps it would allow her to keep up with Jonathan and Edgar. She was about as strong as Jonathan had been 50 or 60 levels ago, at least in terms of destructive potential. He had likely had more stat points than her as a result of his multipliers. However, her skill was quite high, and that evened the gap. As Jonathan jogged through the bustling streets, the gates creaked open, letting the returning party in. Jonathan waited for Edgar and Eva to spot him, and the two fighters quickly picked up the pace, heading towards him. "We managed to defeat one of those golems," Edgar said. "The smiths will be happy with this." Jonathan had discovered that powerful monster parts were sometimes better than metal or other materials for crafters. When a creature could have skin as hard as diamond, would it not be better to use that than a hunk of iron? The other soldiers carried a large sledge filled with chunks of obsidian, as well as parts of the golem's core. A few other monster pieces were there as well, such as the hide of a few of the ash-prowler patriarchs that roamed the wastes. If a monster was Tier 2, then the resources that they provided were Tier 2 as well, which imbued them with an entirely new level of toughness as compared to more mundane, Tier 1 materials. If a Tier 1 piece of metal was like a rod of iron from Earth, then a Tier 2 one was like a diamond. Past that, it was barely comparable. A bunker could be made out of Tier 5 steel that would withstand a nuclear strike without even a scratch. The bodies of mortals lagged behind, understandably, as it was all relative, so steel was just as tough compared to people at the base of its tier that it would be at any tier. Then again, if one focused all of their attention on their durability, it was possible to create a body so tough that it could withstand almost anything. Of course, you would then be left with something akin to a barely mobile hunk of stone that could not actually do anything other than take hits, but some people liked that idea. It was certainly useful if one had a team of allies that could fill all the gaps. However, Jonathan would not let himself get sidetracked by the pursuit of easy power. He was his own weapon. He could easily fight without his gauntlets, and in that there was strength. While most people only had one or two weapons, he had his entire body to fight with. With his boons, his skin was harder than it should have been, making it like rock. That strength would only increase the more powerful he got. He helped the soldiers gather up the materials, taking them to the burgeoning crafting district. There were a few dozen dedicated crafters in the city now, of which a good portion were smiths. Blacksmithing was one of the most popular crafts for a reason, as it was very useful in a world where strength was everything. A good sword or suit of armor could be the difference between life and death in a battle. The most smiths that a faction had, and the better they were at their job, the more likely it was to survive. As they walked into the district, Jonathan took in the various shops that lined the street. The sounds of hammering could be heard coming from the many open front smithies, and other, quieter, crafters worked in their own shops. Tailors and enchanters worked in their establishments on various commissions, and a gentle hum of industry suffused the area. None of the crafters were powerful enough to work on Jonathan or Edgar's goods, but eventually they would get there. It took a certain degree of strength to work tougher materials, and one had to be at least level 50, with a build orientated toward strength, to be able to work tier 2 metals. Heating them made it easier to work with, but it was still akin to how hammering a solid chunk of steel would be like for a normal human. They made their way towards a materials depot and dropped off the sledge, which was quickly picked up by an assistant that tugged it off into the darkness of the warehouse. With that settled, Jonathan rubbed off his hands and watched as the guards trooped off, leaving him with Edgar. "How goes it with Eva?" he asked curiously, spotting the way that Edgar's gaze lingered on the woman as she walked away. "Well enough," Edgar replied, turning back towards Jonathan. "She is certainly a boon in these dark times. Some companionship of the opposite sex is always welcome. Not to say that you are not diverting enough though. My foremost loyalty is to our mission. Eva sees that, I think. That sounds good. Both for you and for the faction. You are our second strongest fighter after all. It would not serve for you to be overly distracted," Jonathan replied. He winced a moment later. That had sounded quite harsh. Edgar didn't seem to mind however, and he simply smiled. They walked back to the cave in companionable silence, ready to delve into the realm of Tartarus once more. The city was in good hands now, and they could devote more time to raising their level. Jonathan wanted to reach level 150 by the end of the next month, but he wasn't sure how realistic that was, given that the amount of essence that he would gain would be diminished the closer that he got to the level of the monsters that he was fighting. If he was actually at level 150, it would take dozens, or even hundreds, of kills at that level to even gain a single level. However, the only thing to do was to try. Granath would not wait for them to reach a sufficient level, so it was in their interest to progress as fast as they could. Jonathan and Edgar had tried to take other people to the realm of Tartarus with them, but they had discovered that only 2 people could go at one time. Even worse, it seemed that both men's mana signatures were keyed to the token, which meant that they were the only ones who could go, no matter the configuration. They had tried to bring Eva, but she was unable to enter the realm. It was annoying that this had not been written on the token, but perhaps it was designed to transport people more powerful than Jonathan, and the only reason Edgar was able to come along for the ride was because there was excess energy. It was only a theory on Jonathan's part, but his theories had the intriguing habit of often coming true. That was probably an effect of his high intelligence, but it could have been just pure luck as well. Luck seemed to be on his side in any case, as he had survived many encounters that should have been fatal. As they entered the cave, Jonathan pulled out the token, and Edgar clasped it securely. A moment later, the magic of the token whisked them away, transporting them to their last location in Tartarus. They had explored the wide basin that the watchtower had been located in, finding a host of monsters to hone their skills on. However, the nearby Uthraki village had been mostly ignored, given the danger of the settlement. It only had about 100 residents, but all of them were powerful warriors in their own right, and it would be far too difficult for them to defeat the Uthraki all in one go. They would either have to draw them out one by one, or wait until they were stronger. However, the various creatures of this region had grown to know them, and their danger, and it was hard to find any quarries around these parts. The only monsters that remained easy to find were ones that were near the peak of Tier 2, which were almost impossible to fight. Although each man had strength that eclipsed the lower level of the dungeon, some of the monsters were elites as well, and there were even some boss variants. In general, such monsters were stronger than their normal species variants, but while in the ash heaps, they appeared as separate creatures entirely. Here there was a chance for a normal monster to be replaced by a stronger type. An elite monster was generally 1.25 times stronger than a normal monster of the same level, and a boss was even more powerful than that. Neither of them had tested the bosses yet, but it was possible that they were almost twice as powerful as their normal counterparts. As they trudged across the cooled rock of the world, they tried to find a suitable enemy for them to test their skills against. There was nothing in range that they could fight, as the nearest monster was one of the gigantic creatures that was nearly Tier 3. Instead, Jonathan made a snap decision. It was time to probe the depths of the Uthraki villages for the first time. If they were able to lure a few out of the village, then everything would go a lot smoother. What do you think about this, Edgar? We can attack the village, and draw a few guards away with us, Jonathan said as they ran towards the site of the nearest village. It was still over a dozen miles away though. That would be quite risky, but I can see it working. We need another source of essence in any case. There isn't anything else to fight around here. That's what I was thinking. So you're down for it then? Edgar nodded in response, and he cast his movement-enhancing skill, allowing them to run at faster paces than before. They made good time, and they reached the village a few minutes later, stopping to hide behind a small hill. The village was small, but bustled with activity, with villagers moving around the settlement, carrying various items or tending to their flying mounts. All of them seemed to have one of the pterodon mounts, and all of them were over level 150. It seemed that there were no children, only fully grown Uthraki. Jonathan briefly wondered how they bred. Maybe they came out fully formed. He had no idea, but the system had done stranger things before. In any case, there would be no moral qualms about killing children at least. Jonathan wasn't sure if he could have gone through with that, even though they were basically monsters, and all out to kill him. He had killed baby monsters before, but that was different, as those creatures possessed no intelligence, and were simply killers. However, this still made his job easier. As a few of the Uthraki walked out of the village, Jonathan signaled for Edgar to get ready. When the villagers headed beyond the line of sight of the village, both men pounced. The villagers whirled around, their spears at the ready, but it was too late. Jonathan weaved around a quick strike, and drove his fist into the nearest one's stomach, knocking them back a few steps. As the other two targeted him, Edgar sent a barrage of wind bolts, made more powerful by his increased level, into the fallen villager. Attacks that would previously have only left scratches now left deep wounds that bled ferociously. As Jonathan fought, his void mastery showed its worth. He had brought it up to 9% through training, and as a result it was more powerful and easier to use than before. The purple power of the void came to him like it was an extension of his body now, rather than simply a tool that he used. Some of that was due to his true affinity for the element, but the other part was due to simple mastery. He had fought and bled for his knowledge of the void, and now that he was taking the tiniest of steps onto the near-infinite path of his element, he was able to gain the perspective of how far he had to go. Reaching 100% mastery would not just be the fulfillment of some arbitrary number. Rather, it would show that he had gained the fullest comprehension of that element possible. Not only would he be able to manipulate it perfectly, in a way, he would be the void itself. As he weaved around the spear thrusts of his foes, using his element to imbue his fists with devouring power, he exulted in his strength and speed, using it to its fullest potential. As he fought and adapted to this world, his body grew more used to using his full power. Some vestigial remnants of his time on Earth still remained, remnants that screamed abuse at him whenever he tried to use his supernatural abilities. There were still moments when primal terror gripped him upon dropping from a great height, only to fade when he landed safely. He was slowly growing out of them, but it was still a problem, compared to people who had lived in this world for their entire lives. The Uthraki snarled at him as he proved impossible to strike, and he slowly wore them down with his skills. He withheld from going all out, as every battle that was not life or death was nothing more than a training opportunity at this point. He was slowly eclipsing the power of almost everyone within the ash heaps, and soon only Granath would be left, the last obstacle to his rise. These thoughts swirled through him as he parried and struck, sending tremors through the bodies of his enemies. Edgar sent deadly spikes of wind hissing through the air, impaling the villagers like they were rods of sharpened steel. Soon the fighters breathed their last, dropping their spears to the ground as they collapsed, gurgling in death. Essence rushed into him, barely enough to grant him another level. The amount gained was slowing down. Jonathan picked up the spears and put them into his storage device. They would be useful for arming the guards back in the city. Even though the weapons were primitive, they were still Tier 2 weapons, which meant that they were superior to most other weapons that the inhabitants of the city would have access to. Although the ash heaps were technically the domain of both Tier 1 and Tier 2s, it was almost entirely made for Tier 1s, from the mana density, to the resources available. Most of the higher tier goods came from the dungeon, which showed why the place actually existed. It was meant to supplement the resources that could be found in the world. Perhaps the dungeons of the later circles would be fixed in level, rather than adaptive. In any case, Jonathan had a dream of conquering the dungeon, and using it to raise the levels of his guards. Perhaps it was just a pipe dream, but if it worked, the levels of their people would skyrocket. With the spears tucked away, the two men picked up the corpses, Jonathan with his hands, and Edgar with the wind, and carried them towards a nearby lava drift, throwing them in. While the lava in the ash heaps, the natural lava, that was too cool to harm Jonathan, the lava here was more than capable of melting his flesh from his bones. Edgar had tried to explain the concept to him, something to do with energy investment, but most of it had gone over his head. The basic premise was that the higher the concentration of mana in a world, the more the natural world took on the tier of that mana. On Telvaria, the planet, not the universe, the mana was not equally allocated. Some places had higher concentrations, and some had lower ones. Someone from a high-tier mana realm would burn the world around them if they went to a lower tier one without restraining their power. On the other hand, someone going from a low-tier zone to a higher tier one would find their bodies breaking down if the difference was too high. Logically, such a phenomenon occurred in the later Hell circles as well, as they were bigger than entire solar systems in their own right. The planet of Telvaria was almost impossibly big, at least according to Edgar. Nobody in his weak region knew much about it, but it was at least large enough that it would take a tier 10 hundreds of thousands of years to cross it. For a being that strong, circumnavigating the Earth on foot would be a journey of mere minutes. Thus, Telvaria was beyond the scope of Jonathan's limited understanding. The only reason that it did not collapse into a black hole was because of the will of the gods. As the corpses turned into scraps of ash and then nothing, Jonathan sighed. Without a further glance at the lava, he turned his back on it and headed back towards the village. Edgar followed suit. They were a long way away from conquering Tartarus. A few minutes later, they were back in their hiding place, waiting for more of the Dothraki to come their way. However, these beings were far more intelligent than mere dungeon creatures, and when the next patrol came, it was over a dozen strong. That was a number that was beyond the capability of Jonathan and Edgar to fight. It looked like it was time to leave this place. Both men seized the token and winked out of existence, appearing back in the cave. Someone was waiting for them there, standing outside the entrance. It was one of the many merchants that sold their wares down in the city below. However, this one seemed to be excited about something. "My lord," the skinny beastman said, sinking to one knee. He looked like a cross between a hyena and a human. "I bear great news. One of the merchants recently gained access to the Universal Trading Hub, the reward for some achievement that they gained. She wishes to meet with you." Ignoring the fact that the man had addressed him as "my lord," Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "The Universal Trading Hub?" he asked, unfamiliar of the term. "It is one of the key skills in any self-respecting merchant's arsenal. Most gain it at some point between Tier 1 and Tier 2. It is what makes up for our weakness in combat. It will all be self-evident once you see it." Jonathan nodded, and as the Beastman merchant walked out of the cave, he followed. They made their way through the city, and Jonathan noted that the streets seemed almost deserted. His advanced senses picked up a commotion coming out of the center of the merchant's district, and he picked up the pace. A large crowd was gathered around a shimmering disk of light that spun in the air. A woman from a species unfamiliar to Jonathan stood by it. She had reddish skin, with a mottling of scales across it. A single horn protruded out of her forehead. One hand was pointed towards the disk of light, keeping it open. Jonathan pushed through the crowd, and stopped in front of the woman, Edgar standing behind him. "My lord," the woman said, bowing her head. "I wished for you to be the first to see the fruits of my labor. All you need to do is step into the portal." Jonathan appraised the disk of light for a moment, and then nodded. There was no reason for the woman to want to harm him, and her level was too low for any skill that she produced to be able to harm him. Even if this portal was not what it seemed, it would only be a minor setback. He took a deep breath, and strode into the unknown. The world around him seemed to distort and change, and a long tunnel of light stretched out in front of him. A moment later, it contracted, and he stepped out into a bustling panoply of life. An endless array of tents and various shops stretched in every direction, glistening under the light of two suns. Everything felt different, however, as if it was not entirely real. Jonathan was met with a notification almost immediately. "You have entered the Universal Trading Hub. This subrealm was made for the purpose of commerce unfettered by geographical limitations. No violence is allowed here, and all travelers here will have their skills locked. From weapons to alchemical products to natural treasures, almost anything can be found here, as long as you can afford it." Jonathan looked up at the twin suns, and then at the world around him. He was standing in the middle of a bustling neighborhood of what looked to be various textile-related vendors. The portal that he had entered was beside him, seemingly only visible to him. People walked through it without seeming to notice it. There were a few stalls next to him, all of which sold items of clothing. They seemed to be tailored to people of his level, as most of them exuded the aura of a Tier 2 piece of clothing. He walked over to one, curious, and read off the prices. Alpha Ram's wool shirt. 1,500 Telvarian marks. 2,000 Leviathan marks. 2,000 Halcyon marks. 2,500 Outer Realms credits. There were 3 other currencies marked there aside from the Leviathan marks that Jonathan had become familiar with. Telvarian marks, which were likely the currency on the planet of Telvaria, Halcyon marks, which were possibly the currency of the heavens, and Outer Realms credits, which were probably the currency of the worlds of the universe of Telvaria, that were not part of the planet of Telvaria. It seemed that the relative value of these goods was based on the strength of the currency. "Are you gonna buy anything, or are you just here to stare?" the vendor called out, giving Jonathan a nasty look. He quickly realized that he was standing in the way of other patrons. He quickly moved to the side, realizing that he was not the only person here. Strangely, the others almost seemed to be shrouded in shadow, and he could only glean the most basic of attributes from looking at them. A pointed ear here, a tuft of fur there. Perhaps this was to prevent real-world retribution for a perceived slight in this world. In any case, judging by the prices here, there was nothing that he could afford. With a sigh, Jonathan headed back through the portal, appearing in the crowded square in his city. The merchant woman was still standing there, and brightened up as Jonathan exited. "Did it work?" she asked, seemingly too distracted by the fulfillment of her craft to afford him the normal obsequious honorifics. "It was better that way." "It did. I found myself in another world, one filled with stalls and merchants." "I assume that is what you expected?" Jonathan asked. It was. "With this conduit to the outside world, we can now supply this city with far more resources than we could otherwise. The Universal Trading Hub is the one place that denizens of all realms can meet together." "Well, you seem to be the best suited to run this operation," Jonathan declared. "What are you waiting for?" The woman spluttered, but Jonathan simply walked away. He could see that people were trying to rope him into the runnings of the city, but he had no interest in doing such a thing. They had come to him, not the other way around. If anything, he should have simply let them founder out in the ash. Seeing as he was protecting them, he did not want to take on any additional burdens. For now, it was time for more training. With more free time on his hands with the increase in level among the guards, Jonathan knew that it was time to boost his remaining skills to journeyman rank. As he strode away from the market district, Edgar stayed behind to administrate the creation of a permanent portal to the Universal Trading Hub. Jonathan was quite excited about the potential of the portal, but he did not show it. A few minutes later, Jonathan sat in his cave, manipulating the strands of divinity within himself to create runes. He had 3 runes currently in existence, and he knew that to reach journeyman rank, he would have to do something unique with them, or create a new one. Seeing as he wanted to experiment with lessening the drain on his strength from the low ambient mana, he began with his rune of consumption. The first step would be trying to reduce the intake rate from the rune. As it was, the rune took in far too much mana. As soon as it started to run, if it was on Jonathan's skin, it would draw in enough mana to overfill his core, and almost kill him. He needed some sort of limiter, or at least a way to spend some of the mana that was coming his way. He placed down a rune of consumption on the ground, interested in how the amount of divinity that he invested affected the strength. He put as little as he could, creating a dim rune that pulsed weakly. However, it started to pick up power, and soon it was drawing in just as much mana as its more powerful version. Jonathan quickly banished the rune before it could turn his cave into a mana desert, and sighed. The main problem was that the rune drew power from an outside source, and it only needed a tiny kick of divinity to get it working. After that, it was a chain reaction. There was no way that he was going to be able to make this work without invoking another rune. It was time to delve into the world of rune constructs. Firstly, he tried to bind the rune together with his rune of beckoning. Perhaps he could soften the draw upon mana with the other rune, if he used its concept right. He created the rune of beckoning first, allowing it to glow on the cave floor. Next, he created a rune of consumption next to it, allowing the runes to blend. The consumption rune started to draw in power immediately, and the other rune began to pulse softly beside it. Energy started to swirl around them in a helix shape, and funneled into the rune of beckoning, before being recycled back into the original rune. However, it did not solve his problem. The rune of consumption was still taking in too much mana. He cancelled the runes upon seeing that it was too unstable to work, and sighed. He would need to experiment with this one. A few hours later, he had tried to create various constructs, changing the amount of each rune within it. Balancing out the rune of consumption with a cross of 4 runes of beckoning made the intake rate lower, but it still ended up amping up to too strong of a pull. All he was doing was increasing the stable period of the construct, rather than doing anything to make it permanent. He would need a new rune for this, it seemed. With a sigh, he dove into his skill constructs, using TrueSight to check on the other runes available. This would help him increase the level of that skill as well. What he wanted was some sort of power regulator. He could remember seeing runes like that within his skill matrices, but he had no idea what exactly they did. Odds were that if he took them out of the complicated matrix, and used it on its own, it would kill him. However, he did not see any other way, and with his stats already reduced by over 20%, he had little choice in the matter. Sighing, he plucked out one of the runes out with his mind and transcribed it onto the cave floor. His skills in this area had improved greatly, and whereas during the beginning of his tenure as a runecrafter, he had needed to use a mirror, now he could simply delve into his skills without an intermediary. He took a deep breath and placed the regulator rune by the rune of consumption. He knew little about the rune save for a vague notion that it served to regulate power flows. Anything past that was beyond him. A moment later, the rune of consumption started to take in power, but it was blocked by some outside force. The other rune began to glow brighter and brighter as it regulated the mana, but after a few minutes, it burnt out and exploded, taking a large chunk out of the cave floor. If not for Jonathan's high stats, the blast would have injured him. As it was, he simply kept experimenting. A notification waited for him however, and he quickly checked it. You have discovered a new rune. Rune of Parsimony. This rune serves to decrease the energy intake of more greedy runes like the rune of consumption, allowing for stable rune constructs that involve a power source. At higher levels, it is able to regulate reality itself within a limited range. However, if overloaded, the rune will detonate with a strength based on the amount of energy regulated. The name suggested that the rune had something to do with the effective usage of materials, and it seemed that this was exactly what he had needed. The only thing to be wary about was the detonation at the end. Jonathan got back to work, testing various strengths and numbers of runes. Simply regulating the amount of mana intake was not enough. He needed to balance it so that the runes had a chance to process the mana back into the central rune before exploding. He couldn't simply slap a few runes of parsimony upon the rune of consumption. That would only prolong the detonation, not prevent it. He fell into a trance within that cave, and he spent days tinkering with the runes. Edgar came about a few times, but did not bother him. Dozens, or maybe hundreds, of failed attempts later, Jonathan finally did it. A complicated array of half a dozen runes of parsimony, each imbued with 5 points of divinity, which was hard to measure, given that there was no resource bar, and a single rune of consumption, using up the remaining 70 points of divinity. As the central rune cycled the mana into it, each of the other ones worked together to regulate it. Too much power in the runes of parsimony resulted in nothing happening, and too much created an explosion. However, this one had run for over an hour, and he was eventually met with a notification. You have created a runic array. Mana Magnet Array. This runic array draws in ambient mana and allows for it to be processed. It can be used for many different things, from mana batteries to empowering living beings. Created from a balance of 2 different rune types, it is a marvel of runic engineering, at least for someone as unversed as you. Jonathan ignored the latter half of the description, and found another notification waiting for him. It was the one that he was waiting for. You have reached journeyman rank in runecrafting. Runecrafting is an art that only you, and the system, possess. Going against all odds, and the warnings of a being far wiser than you, you have managed to take this art into a stage approaching competence. Creating skills, or tapping into the advanced runes is far beyond you, but you will eventually reach that level. Plus 15 to intelligence, plus 10 to wisdom. Naturally, a notification for TrueSight awaited him as well. You have reached journeyman rank in TrueSight. Your talents in runecrafting are only possible with your ability to parse archaic runes and divine their meaning. Without this, you would be like a blind man groping in the dark. This skill is still new and unrefined, but its potential grows greater by the second. Plus 15 to wisdom, plus 10 to intelligence. Jonathan flopped backwards, mentally drained from his experience. However, he still had something to do. Now that he knew that his rune construct was safe, he created a series of runes on his skin, hissing in pain. He made sure to draw the rune of consumption last. With a hum, the rune construct came online, and power suddenly rushed into him. Effective mana density has reached tier 2. All power demerits have been cancelled. The only thing left was to set up all of the tier 2s with this rune. It would be a great asset in the war against Granath. Jonathan's chances of winning were growing higher and higher. It would do little against Granath himself, as the worm dwelt within a zone of higher mana concentration anyway, but it would help for the defense of this city. Jonathan got to his feet, stretching, and headed out of the cave and into the sunlight for the first time in days. He didn't really need to stretch anymore, but it was more of a vestigial reflex imbued in him from his time as a normal human. Back on Earth, sitting still for days would have done a lot more to him than simply triggering a languid stretch. He headed down into the city, which looked even larger than it had before. An entire section had been set aside for the purpose of taking full advantage of the portal to the Universal Trading Hub. Jonathan idly wondered what would happen if more merchants gained the ability. He would have to find out. As he walked, the mana density around him decreased as the runic array sucked the energy out of the air. It created a zone of tier 2 mana around him, most of which was funneled into his body. In any case, even with the low density of the ambient mana, there was far more of it than anything Jonathan could siphon away with his array. He would not be running out anytime soon. He had a spike of divinity ready to destroy the runes if they proved to be unstable, but so far he was satisfied with their power. He knew that it would not be past the system to feed him a false notification to assure him of the safety of his array, while it was actually unstable in reality. One of these days, the system would try to kill him again, and he needed to be vigilant. Some time later, Jonathan entered the merchant district, wanting to see the progress that had been made on the portal. While he as not technically in charge of the city, he still had a greater vested interest in it than anyone else. It was an important part of his quest to destroy the infinite hells for good. The portal hummed and whirred with power as people stepped in and out of it. It was in the center of a square that was filled with stalls, with merchants hawking exotic wares that could only have come from the trading hub. It looked like it was already injecting some wealth into the city. Judging by the powerful weapons that Jonathan saw on display, this was for the better. As long as the merchants were not extorting the citizens, it would be fine. Then Jonathan remembered that anyone could enter the portal. If someone was unhappy with the prices here, they could simply enter the trading hub. Because the majority of people here were tier 1, the prices would be cheaper as well. It seemed that only one person could use it at a time, however, and the merchant who the portal belonged to was sitting by it, poring over a piece of paper. The woman looked flustered but happy, and she was probably raking in experience for her class by the bucketful. Jonathan walked over, the crowd seeming to subconsciously part before him as he walked. Then again, judging by the looks of awe he was getting, it was more of a deliberate thing. He knew that his aura was completely retracted, but they still made way. Jonathan sighed and headed towards the merchant woman, sidestepping a man coming out of the portal. It seemed that there was some sort of minor time dilation effect within the trading hub, as people were swapping places far faster than it would take to complete a transaction. Or maybe the merchants were just fast. Jonathan had no idea. The woman looked up from her paper upon seeing Jonathan and smiled. Faction leader. It has been some time. Yeah, I had some things to attend to. How is the portal working so far? I can see that people are coming in and out rather quickly. How exactly does that work? Jonathan asked. It runs off of mana. Depending on how much I put in, a minor time dilation effect is created that allows for quick transitions in relative time here. I wish there was more mana though. Jonathan frowned, noting a small conduit of mana running from the woman's chair to the portal. I might have something to help with that, he said. Also, I never got your name. My name is Canessa, the woman replied. Canessa? Not related to Janessa by any chance? Jonathan said, raising an eyebrow. You know my cousin? The woman said, sitting up straighter. I met her a few months back. She was the librarian of one of the towns further into the ash heaps. I don't know where she is now though. Perhaps she will come here. That is good news indeed, Canessa said, smiling. What about that mana you were talking about though? Right. I'm not sure if this will work, but here goes. Jonathan walked over to the portal, and tried to gauge the amount of mana that it was taking in. From his experiences creating the mana magnet array, he found that its draw was about a quarter of the strength of his own draw on the ambient mana. It was a shockingly low amount of mana for such a powerful skill, but it was supplemented by elemental energy as well, which seemed to come from the air around it. Mana was a lot harder to channel naturally than elemental energy, as it had no inclination to clump together. Jonathan adjusted the parameters on his mana magnet array, and created it on the ground next to the portal. It lit up as mana started to pulse around it, and Canessa raised an eyebrow. Interesting. If I establish a conduit from the mana array to the portal, it could run indefinitely. She got out of the chair and touched the array, closing her eyes. The stream of mana coming from her was immediately taken over by the array, and she took a step backwards. The portal sputtered, and then blazed into life, continuing without Canessa's input. Jonathan felt a small amount of pathway skill experience trickle in from creating the array and manipulating it. Luckily, it only looked like a glyph array from the outside, so nobody would bat an eyebrow at Jonathan. Barely anyone knew about glyphs enough to become suspicious, and what exactly were they going to do anyway? The system already knew that he possessed the power of the runes. It was far more dangerous than anything else that might come for him. Jonathan bid Canessa farewell, and, inspired by his success, decided to check the rest of the city for opportunities to use his array. It would help him train his skills, as well as help out the city. As it turned out, many things ran on mana around the city. A lot of the industry was supplemented by mana-powered machinery, which was oddly similar to the tech back on Earth. From mana-powered looms to mana-powered forges, it made itself known everywhere. None of it was overt, but it was there to help the artisans work. A lot of the requisite tech had come from the trading hub, it seemed, as Jonathan had never seen anything like it before in the ash heaps. Perhaps Granath made sure to round up all the merchants who gained access to the hub, so that nobody would be able to progress without him saying so. That made a lot of sense to Jonathan. Normally by this point, a high-level team would have come around to take all of the advancements away, but Jonathan had defeated the last one, with the help of Edgar, so their city was being allowed to develop at an abnormal rate. At this rate, in a few more months of growth, it would rival the capital in terms of wealth. Well, maybe not that much. The Ashen Citadel was the center of all trade in this world, and the place where most people lived. This city was not anywhere near that level. Perhaps that would all change in the near future though, as long as the city was ready to rebuff any and all attacks. Granath would not sit idly as his kingdom was disrupted, and Jonathan knew that complacency would kill everyone here. It was why he had instructed the council to focus on military growth. They were almost all pains in the neck to deal with, especially the badger woman who had insulted him, but they knew more about politics than him. When it came to the running of a city, they were all far more qualified than he was. It was up to him to provide for the defense of the settlement against foes too powerful for anyone else to deal with. It was intriguing that this city had come together so quickly. Back on Earth, it would have taken years for a city to grow to this level. Here, there were no laws or zoning restrictions to inhibit the creation of a city however, which meant that it could develop as quickly as its inhabitants could work. In a world where a decently leveled person was akin to a machine, people could work very quickly indeed. Jonathan made his way around the city, finding places where his runic expertise was useful. As he finished empowering the 7th mana-powered forge, he noticed a stack of metal tiles on the side of the smith's table, and had an idea. "Mind if I borrow a few of those?" Jonathan asked, looking at the smith, a heavy-set Orcish man. The smith nodded immediately, not wanting to upset Jonathan. Half of the people in the city regarded him with respect, and the other half with reverence. This was a world where power begot power, and that power was often misused. Jonathan was powerful enough to destroy anyone in this city in a matter of seconds, save perhaps for Edgar. If he went all out, he was likely one of the strongest beings in this circle. Jonathan picked up one of the slabs, and tried to engrave his runic array into it. To his surprise, it worked. The tablet of metal lit up with power, and started to cycle mana through it. With a glint in his eye, Jonathan picked up the metal slabs, and walked off with them, interested in their potential. If he could continuously create these, and find a way to match the mana input required by the machines that people were using, which were standardized as a result of their origin, he could make them far faster than before. However, it would be quite challenging to find the right amount of energy for them to work like that. For now, it seemed that he had a useful quest for the next few weeks, along with his exploration of Tartarus. It was time to ramp up his development. A few hours later, Jonathan had gathered up Edgar, and was preparing to enter Tartarus. He had explained to the man about his breakthrough in his mana array, which, according to Edgar, would be invaluable if they managed to reach the next realm. In its current state, it was able to counteract the natural limiter on Jonathan's strength by increasing the ambient mana density, but in a world where the mana density was already high enough, it would allow him to increase his mana regeneration rate. While it would only ever be able to do so by a small amount, as it would otherwise blow up his core, it would still be a boost beyond the norm. That also brought up the possibility of other runic enhancements, such as ones for strength, or other concepts. However, those were a lot further away than his mana regeneration array, and far more dangerous too. In any case, what mattered now was gaining levels. Giving Edgar a nod, Jonathan pulled out the entrance token, and extended it to the other man. They both grabbed on, and Jonathan triggered it, teleporting them to the other dimension. It was time for some leveling. Neither man had made a concerted effort to explore this world before now, because they had not wished to linger long enough for any serious threat to emerge in the outside world, but now that the city was far more capable than before, it was time. They emerged into the scalding plains of Tartarus a moment later, with the languid wind of the realm caressing their armor. Tartarus was not a world with any sort of meteorological phenomena, but the sheer heat of it created all sorts of air currents and thermals that swept through the land. Hot air rose and then condensed on the marginally cooler cave ceiling, before dropping down, creating a cycle of air that mimicked the wind. It was not enough to provide any sort of relief, but Jonathan did not really need any. Edgar had his own mastery of the wind to rely on in any case. As they started across the plain, Jonathan ran through the various discoveries that he had made in this world over the last few weeks, few as they were. Other than the Uthraki village, all of the beings within the vicinity were monsters, and they ranged widely in level. Jonathan peered towards the north, spotting a line of gigantic dinosaur-like monsters trooping across the plain. Each of the creatures was at least 100 feet tall, and many times that in length. Jonathan had spotted a pod of such dinosaurs, or, as Edgar called them, precursor drakes, a week ago, but this was the first time seeing them since. They were migrating somewhere, but without a map of this world, it was impossible to know where. Tartarus was not like a dungeon, and one could walk for months without reaching the end. Jonathan and Edgar could move a lot faster than that, but the natural danger of the high-leveled monsters prevented such rash decisions. While both men were fast, there were always things that were faster. Majestic beasts soared in the air above, carried on scaly wings through the looping currents of air that gusted high above them. They were propelled by the supernatural strength of the system, as such beings would have plummeted from the sky without it. Each had a wingspan of about 150 feet, and a body about a quarter as long. The creatures were far away, but if Jonathan and Edgar drew attention to themselves, they would come swooping down. They had learned that the hard way about 2 weeks ago. The creatures were incredibly annoying to deal with, as they were simply able to fly away if they felt threatened, and simply strafe them from the air. It had been so hard to deal with that Jonathan had simply left the realm, hiding in a cave for the required minute out of combat, rather than waiting to fight. "I don't like this," he said to Edgar. "It's too quiet here. Almost as if something has scared off all the other monsters." "I agree." Edgar looked up. "Those flying beasts are still there, but they are farther away than usual." As the men edged forward slowly, an ominous presence started to rise up from the lava river in front of them. The molten rock started to bubble and shake as something beneath it moved. Something titanic. Loops of lava flew up into the air as something surfaced, and Jonathan fumbled for his token. Whatever was coming, it was too strong to deal with without a safety measure in place. The men had been lucky thus far, but they were bound to run into something that they could not fight eventually. As Jonathan started to gear up for battle, he realized that his mana regeneration rate had been improved slightly. It was proof of concept for the effects that his runic array should have brought. It was only a tiny amount, about 5% faster than normal, but it was still noticeable. Making more arrays would do nothing but overload his mana core, but perhaps he would be able to find a more powerful array in the future. All of the runes that he had found this far were very specific, which meant that they were weak. Jonathan directed this regeneration to his mana as he empowered his fists with purple energy, just in case they were unable to escape. Jonathan held out the token, but to his horror, it did not work. Edgar let go of the token, his face grim, and stared at the lava river. Jonathan only then realized that the ominous presence must have been the aura of the monster, and that it counted as an attack for the purposes of his token. "Damn it!" he cursed, starting to run. Behind him, a torrent of lava exploded into the air as a sinuous shape rose from the lava. Easily 200 feet long and as thick as two men standing on each other's shoulders, it was some sort of eel. Fiery streaks of energy raced up and down its sides, painting the air with heat and light. It flopped down onto the stone, its body heat melting the rock like it was made of butter. Edgar started to cast his buff skill, which had been upgraded over the last few weeks. It now provided a larger bonus to himself, which meant that he could more easily keep up with Jonathan. A piercing cry ripped through the air, and a sudden prickling of heat on Jonathan's neck caused him to roll to the side. Just in time, as a lance of lava speared into the ground next to him, splattering molten rock everywhere. Edgar managed to force the lava droplets away with his wind powers, but the heat was still staggering. The creature started to slither across the ground, and picked up pace rapidly, moving far faster than it should have been able to. Jonathan risked a glance backwards, and saw that jets of fire were propelling it, leaving a furrow of molten earth behind it. Scanning the beast, he learned that it was almost peak tier 2. This was not a fight he could win, the aura was incredibly inconvenient, as it was preventing them from leaving. They would have to get out of range to escape. Spotting an Ithraki village in the distance, Jonathan had an idea. "Follow me," he shouted at Edgar, changing his trajectory. Edgar followed him, and the two men legged it as fast as they could. However, the monster behind them was faster. Swearing loudly, Jonathan scooped up Edgar onto his back and used Smite, rocketing them across the ground. Adding in his stamina abilities, he was able to increase the gap somewhat. The village was still over a dozen miles away however, and they were not going to make it. With a groan, Jonathan sent 30 stat points into dexterity, increasing it by 45 points. If he had slowed enough to concentrate on allocating them individually, he would have died. As a result, he lost out on 5 stat points, but it hardly mattered. New speed surged into his limbs, and he started to outpace the monster somewhat. Spotting its prey getting away, the creature upped the pace, speeding across the dark stone of the cavern floor. It was annoyingly persistent. It moved almost like a worm, bunching up parts of its body as it went. The only reason that it did not look utterly comical was because of the speed that it was going at. It left cracks in the rapidly cooling ground behind it, and its gaping maw dripped red-hot saliva in anticipation of the tasty morsels of essence in front of it. Jonathan was almost to safety however, and he chained usages of his stamina redirection ability to get him closer to the village. As he neared, the Dothraki poured out of their huts, eager to hunt him. Then they spotted the monster. Jonathan dashed through the squat huts of the village, avoiding the spears being thrown his way. Edgar directed the wind around himself to send the Otlotls flying away. The two men led the monster through the village, and it crushed houses and villagers alike in its fervent pursuit. The Dothraki cried out in alarm and attacked the creature, sending their spears arcing into its flesh. With a roar of rage, the creature paused, and started to attack the villagers instead. They were a lot more enticing than Jonathan and Edgar were. Jonathan crowed in victory as he raced through the village, only taking a moment to study the makeup of the small settlement. There were only a few dozen houses, and none of them were over a story in height. It looked like these Dothraki were more of a settler force than anything else. However, there were likely far larger settlements further into this world, and entire cities. There were sure to be more challenges in this world, and more powerful fighters. Everything here was Tier 2, and that included the civilians, if there even were any. Perhaps all of the Dothraki were fighters. Behind Jonathan, the towering monster whipped its tail through the village, scattering rocks and turning bodies to molten slag. A wave of its hot breath came roiling out of its mouth every few seconds, baking the ground with its heat. However, the Dothraki were far from defenseless, and they were starting to wear down the monster. There were hundreds of them, and although a few died now and again, there was strength in numbers. A few houses to the left, a hulking fighter burst out, holding a massive axe in two hands. The Dothraki was almost a dozen feet tall, and covered in rippling red muscles. With a roar of rage, he threw himself towards the encroaching monster, activating a skill that sent shockwaves through the air. Dust scattered everywhere as the man, undoubtedly the leader of this village, soared through the air towards the monster. Raising his axe high, he sent mana pouring into the weapon, bringing it down like a thunderbolt on the eel's head. The monster hissed and surged upwards, opening its mouth wide. As the two collided, a blast wave shot outwards from the collision, sending a dome of energy crackling through the air. The eel struggled for a moment and then was pummeled into the ground, weakened by the continuous strikes from below. Jonathan kept running, wary of reprisal from the villagers, to whose village he had led the beast. He did not look back. A few miles away, he stopped to gather his breath, and smite wore off, filling his body with fatigue. It was a far cry from unconsciousness, but the effects did scale somewhat with the amount of divinity he placed in the skill, which meant that the after effects did as well. He sat down, taking a few deep breaths, and Edgar hopped off his back. That creature might have been strong, but it was little in the face of Granath's might, Jonathan replied, trying to keep his mind on the end goal. We need to get more power, and quickly at that. With my new runic abilities, I have a few ideas that I want to test out. But first, let's get out of here. We're too close to that village for comfort. I'm sure that powerhouse Dothraki spotted us. Without further ado, Jonathan used the token, teleporting himself and Edgar out of Tartarus. It was time to engrave one of the mana magnet arrays on his friend, and the guards. In an effort to conserve divinity, Jonathan decided to wait until he could gather as many people as possible. It would be more efficient that way. Before Edgar could question anything, Jonathan raced out of the cave, waving his hand for the other man to follow. They both dashed down the mountainside and into the city, where Jonathan started rounding up everyone that he could see over level 75. He wanted to save this array for people who actually mattered in the grand scheme of things. If he went around granting it to everyone, the city would quickly turn into a mana desert, which would serve nobody. He knew little about the ways of mana, but there was likely something on it within the diary. Jonathan had found it suspicious that there were so many anecdotes to things only slightly related to the ostensible meaning of the book, almost as if Patrolanus, the mysterious man who had penned it, was trying to prime somebody to take up his position. In any case, it hardly mattered now. By the time that he was done, Jonathan had gathered over a dozen guards, as well as Eva. Other than that, there was nobody else at that level. Non-combat classers were too weak to try to gain essence through combat, at least in this region, and hardly needed to at any rate. Other than stats, they mainly used their pathway skills. Because the system of this world did not excessively gatekeep skills or experience behind levels or tiers, this was fine. Jonathan quickly gathered up his slightly confused charges, and took them back to his cave. He could only imagine what they were thinking at this point. He also noticed that Edgar had drifted back towards Eva, and now had his arm around the woman's shoulder. She was smiling brightly at the contact. Jonathan only hoped that no tragedy would break up the couple. Their relationship was still in its infancy, but he knew that Edgar genuinely cared about the woman. The only problem was that she was nowhere near as talented as Edgar or Jonathan were. She would undoubtedly fall behind eventually, and in a realm-spanning quest, that could not be tolerated. Still, Edgar could enjoy his bliss for now. Jonathan was not so hardened that he would deny him that. Edgar was wise enough to not take it further than was necessary. They eventually reached the cave, where Jonathan paused. "I know you all must be confused as to why I brought you here, other than Edgar, but rest assured, it is for a good reason." He peeled off a plate of his armor, showing them the array on his skin. "This is a spell construct that I recently learned to create, one that will increase your mana regeneration rate. It is only a small amount, but I believe that it might be beneficial." He had expected scorn, or perhaps a slight feeling of gratitude from the others, but he was not prepared for the stunned silence that ensued. Eva broke it a moment later. "Is this for real? You managed to create a permanent glyph construct?" she asked, seeming incredulous. Jonathan frowned. Had he inadvertently created something too powerful to be plausible? Yes. Jonathan responded. "Well, I never took you for a glyph master, but you must have hidden depths," Eva replied, looking impressed. "I look forward to helping you test it out." Jonathan nodded, relieved, and started to draw the array on the ground to show the others what it did. It looked like none of the people here were experienced enough to tell truth from fiction in the advanced applications of glyphs. "I designed this to alleviate the negative effects of the low mana concentration in this realm. However, it can be used to power machinery, and bolster the regeneration of those under Tier 2. It is something that I cannot use too often however, as the mana concentration in the city will dip." "If that is true, faction leader, that is something that will greatly increase the power of this city," one of the guards said. "Not that I doubt you, of course." He hurriedly added. "Relax. I'm not going to bite your head off for a turn of phrase," Jonathan replied, smiling. The man, and indeed a lot of other citizens, were used to the fickle temperaments of higher-level beings, many of whom were insufferably arrogant. He kept drawing out the array, and watched as it started to suck the mana from the air. Evidently satisfied, the guards clamored to be the first, but in the end, Edgar went before them. Jonathan quickly etched the sigil into the man's flesh with his gauntlet, eliciting a hiss of pain. He did not have to worry about anything like infection, given the other man's high stats. A moment later, Edgar took a deep breath, and smiled, evidently feeling the power return to him. A few minutes later, everyone else was done as well, and they seemed pleased with the results of the array. The guards vanished over the next few moments, leaving Jonathan standing with Eva and Edgar. "You were quite generous to share such a gift with my men," Eva said, giving Jonathan a look of gratitude. "Few wizards would have done such a thing." "Wizards?" Jonathan asked. He knew what the word meant, but was not sure how it applied to him. "Ah, do you not call your path that?" Eva asked. "In my community, those who could manipulate the glyphs were called wizards. Perhaps you know it by a different name." Wizard works well enough, Jonathan said, grinning slightly. At one point in a person's life, at least on Earth, they had dreamed of harnessing the power of magic. This was no different. He took in his handiwork on the bodies of his allies, watching as mana was drawn into the arrays, and cycled into their bodies. Jonathan knew that what he had achieved was nothing more than simply using runes that somebody else, namely the system, had already created, but perhaps he would eventually be able to make his own runes. That would be a far-off day indeed. Throughout the ash heaps, the tread of thousands of steel-clad feet echoed through the empty ash, heralding something that had not been known to this realm in eons. War. For the first time in thousands of years, Granath was worried about the strength of another being enough to send his forces after them. Not only that, but in massive numbers. Garrisons had been emptied, old favors called up, and powerhouse fighters dispatched to lead the army. With over 500 Tier 2 leaders, and innumerable Tier 1s, multiple strands of regiments and detachments marched across the endless ash. Of course, this was but a small fraction of the totality of Granath's armies, but it was a sizable force for its target. They had been marching for the last few weeks, at a pace that all of the soldiers could keep up. If the Tier 2s had raced ahead, they could have made it to Jonathan's base through other means, whether through flight of simply overwhelming speed, but they had waited. Granath wanted to make an example of the rebel against his name that was Jonathan. As the army had passed through the realm, they had left a burning pyre of rumors to spread, ushering out an old era, and bringing in a new. For the first time in a while, people had a spark of hope in the darkness, the belief that perhaps something might change. Of course, none dared to voice this, but people mysteriously vanished in the night, leaving only a message that alluded to them leaving for a better land. These departures were always small compared to the number of people living under Granath's thumb, but they were still noticeable. A coalition of powerful fighters led the army, some of the greatest figures from across the ash heaps. Some of the upper echelon of the Crimson sect traveled in style on vast floating barges of blood, while the generals of the army strode below, their auras billowing across the land. It was nothing compared to the armies massed in the later realms, where the stock of fodder was easier to draw on, but it was imposing for the ash heaps. Jonathan did not know what was coming for him. In Jonathan's city. Jonathan knew that his city was in jeopardy. The forces of Granath were no doubt swooping towards it, and there were only so many things that he could do to increase his power. None of his pathway skills were anywhere near ranking up, and he could sense that none of his normal skills were near a breakthrough either. All that was left were his levels, and his elemental mastery. Edgar had hinted at a transformation coming at 10% mastery, which had spurred Jonathan on to train continuously for the few days after allocating the arrays to the strongest fighters of his city. Cultivating his elemental energy was difficult, but not impossible, and he had seen minor improvements in that time. It was more of a matter of filling himself with the concept of his element, rather than fully understanding it, at least at this point. Perhaps he would eventually have to comprehend what the void truly was, but for now, all he needed to do was to increase his connection. He sat in silence, meditating on the vast ball of purple energy that rotated in some conceptual plane, deep beneath his consciousness. It was in a place without a place, a time without a time, somewhere where the primal forces of the universe could be observed by a mere mortal. If not for his true affinity, Jonathan knew that there was no way that he would have ever mastered the void. Even using it would have torn him apart before doing anything to his foes. However, he was immune to its effect, likely because it saw him as a part of it, which meant that he could channel its power. He could sense that this was part of what he needed to break past 10%, but he needed to codify it into an insight that would allow him to pass that mark. The void was an element that represented utter destruction. The complete erasure of everything, without boundaries. For a mortal to channel that meant that a piece of the void was inside of them. But how did that work? I need to approach this in a different way, Jonathan thought. What is the void, conceptually speaking? Why does it not simply eradicate the universe? It does not have any elemental partner, like the other ones. Then, after days of meditation, it suddenly hit him. The void did have an elemental counterbalance. It was of all the other elements. If the 12 elements made up creation, then the void was destruction itself. With a sudden surge of power, he felt his mastery creep up to 10%. You have reached the 10% mastery milestone of your element. You are eligible to direct your mastery towards a new skill, from one of the following categories. Physical mastery. Y/N. Magical mastery. Y/N. From the message, Jonathan could tell that he now had an opportunity to streamline whatever skill he got towards his own needs. He was tempted by the physical option, but then realized that he could probably direct the magical one towards improving his void rocket skill. He conceptualized the skill in his mind, and then selected magical mastery, feeling a torrent of insight enter his mind. Those insights were directed towards his skill, and a moment later, it evolved. You have upgraded one of your skills. Void Rocket, Epic-Void Cannon, Legendary. With increased channeling potential compared to its previous iteration, this skill allows you to channel the true power of the void, at least at your current understanding. Unbind the world itself with your strength, sending the pure energy of the void to cleanse your enemies. Jonathan smiled at the upgrade, and raced out of the cave. He idly realized that he was starting to become somewhat of a closet progressor, retreating to his cave whenever he had a breakthrough to make. It was oddly similar to the concept of cultivation that he had pondered before. If there was some grand architect of his fate out there, writing his story into being, perhaps he was but one of many projects, all of which had similar power sets. Then he shook his head. Where the hell did that come from? He wondered, before banishing the thought. He had come out to test his skill. Holding out one hand, Jonathan expelled the primal power of the void, using the same channels as with his void rocket skill. Rather than creating a small bolt of power, a telephone pole-thick lance of energy leaped from his fingers, soaring into a nearby hill. There was a flash of light, and then the dust cleared to reveal a dozen-foot-wide crater. His power had gone up. Jonathan grinned. There was nothing like a good level up or skill increase to make his day. Then he looked down towards his rapidly growing city, and frowned. All of this would be lost if Granath won. He knew that his power was not yet enough to stand against the forces of the ash heaps and win, which meant that his people would have to pick up the slack. Rumors of armies massing across the realm came in through new arrivals, and Jonathan was starting to take them seriously. It was time to start taking his own part in preparation, using his runes. If he could hammer out another array, he could fortify the city more effectively. In fact, he had just the idea. Using his rune of hatred and his rune of beckoning in unison had already worked in the past. What if he combined them into an array? That would likely increase the power even more. There would likely be little experimentation to do either. It might even increase his runecrafting skill. Jonathan sat down, and started to experiment with his runes, using them in a similar configuration to how he made them on his gauntlets. The runes were not as complicated as his other ones, as they did not involve mana, but they were still tough to get to work together. Their concepts were not aligned, as one of them was trying to push away and harm its target, while the other was trying to draw it on. He would have to make some sort of binary rune system for this to work. As the city bustled with life below him, Jonathan sank into a trance, the second of many in his line of work as a runecrafter. Combining runes should have been tedious, but his mind found it intuitive, and he soon had a multitude of prototypes going. Different configurations of the runes had different effects, from simply going off as soon as it was created, to never going off at all. The key to arrays was balance, and Jonathan eventually found the answer. Because the rune of beckoning was more subtle in nature than the rune of hatred, he needed more of them to balance out the other rune. He finally created a triangle-like array, with 2 runes of beckoning beneath 1 rune of hatred, using thirds of his divinity supply to imbue them. He watched the rune circuit in apprehension, but was eventually met with a notification telling him of his success. This array had only taken him a few hours to make, compared to his first array. You have created a runic array. Toxic Longing Array. This array draws in enemies to their doom, using the rune of beckoning to attract them, and the rune of hatred to obliterate them. It is a contradiction in terms, but it still works, a testament to the binary nature of existence. The name of the array was a bit strange, as Jonathan had been expecting something a bit more utilitarian, but it hardly mattered. It did what he wanted it to. Jonathan decided to check on his full repertoire of runes and arrays after this, remembering that it was not visible on his status sheet. All he had to do was to go back through his notifications log, however, and he soon had a sheet filled with his runes and their descriptions. However, since he had never seen the description for his rune of beckoning, he had the system make one for him. Rune of Hatred. This rune, powered by divinity, will kill any enemies within a certain radius. The radius, and the power of the rune, depends on the amount of divinity placed into it. Rune of Beckoning. This rune, powered by divinity, will draw in all those who come within its radius, enticing them with its power. This effect is potent, and becomes more potent the more divinity is placed within it. Rune of Consumption. This rune, powered by divinity, will draw upon its conceptual nature to devour all mana within its radius of effect, and deliver it into whatever medium the rune is inscribed upon. You can upgrade this rune to devour more substances by furthering your understanding of it. The radius, and the power of the rune, depends on the amount of divinity placed into it. Rune of Parsimony. This rune, powered by divinity, serves to decrease the energy intake of more greedy runes like the rune of Consumption, allowing for stable rune constructs that involve a power source. At higher levels, it is able to regulate reality itself within a limited range. However, if overloaded, the rune will detonate with a strength based on the amount of energy regulated. Mana Magnet Array. This runic array draws in ambient mana and allows for it to be processed. It can be used for many different things, from mana batteries to empowering living beings. Created from a balance of two different rune types, it is a marvel of runic engineering, at least for someone as unversed as you. Toxic Longing Array. This runic array draws in enemies to their doom, using the rune of beckoning to attract them, and the rune of hatred to obliterate them. It is a contradiction in terms, but it still works, a testament to the binary nature of existence. With that over, Jonathan was able to run through his runes, and search for possible synergies. However, with the addition of his new array, he had a better idea. Jonathan made his way down the side of the mountain, using his superior stats to traverse the side of the sheer rock face, in order to get out of the city. He reached the ground, dropping the last 100 feet, and began to engrave his new array into the ground around the wall. Further out into the plain, a few earth mages were using their powers to dig a massive ditch around the city, lining it with jagged spikes of rock. Jonathan watched them for a moment and then got back to work. He created one of the arrays every dozen feet, waiting for his divinity to regenerate in between them. He could tell that he was close to ranking up his pathway skill, what with his new array, but it would still be quite far away. Between the time taken to engrave the runes, as well as the time it took for his divinity to regenerate, Jonathan spent almost 6 hours walking around the wall, creating his runes. He made sure that they were far enough away from the wall that if they were triggered, nothing would happen to the city wall. All of the damage would be directed to the enemy. Each of these constructs were a lot more powerful than they would have been had Jonathan created them when he first started along his path. His understanding of the runes had one up, as well as his divinity reserves. As a result, they would probably be able to kill almost any Tier 1 threat, and perhaps damage a weak Tier 2. As for the stronger fighters, Jonathan would have to deal with them himself. All that mattered was that the city was ready. By the time that he was finished, the city was ringed with the reddish arrays, even around the back of the mountain. He knew that some of the stronger enemy soldiers would be able to simply jump over the arrays, but for the foot soldiers, they would be potent demonstrations of Jonathan's might. Each explosion would be able to take out dozens of the fighters, and while that would likely be nothing in the face of the hordes to come, it would be a good opening salvo. The next stage of defense was up to the defenders, however, and Jonathan made his way back into the city to see what was happening. Some of the artisans had been sufficiently motivated by the threat of encroaching death to begin the construction of various artillery pieces, some of which were already on the walls. From ballistas to catapults, all manner of magical siege weaponry was arrayed against the enemy. Jonathan would have tried to create guns from his knowledge about earthling weaponry, but he had to remind himself that these weapons were made out of materials that transcended mortal boundaries. Each of those ballistas was equivalent to a cannon. Back on Earth, he hoped up onto the wall to begin his circuit, inspecting the weapons as he went. All of them were quite hasty in construction, but they were definitely serviceable. Some of them had magical effects attached to them, added by various enchanters around the city. To Jonathan's true sight ability, it looked as if there was a faint haze of mana around them. He had realized that his skill could show energy concentrations in an area if he used it correctly, and with it active and in its channeled form, he could detect traces of elemental energy. All around the weapons were trails of power, from the orange energy of fire, to the yellow energy of earth. The colors of the various elements had been shown in the diary, and Jonathan knew them off by heart now. As he moved, he ticked them off. Fire was a bright orange color that flickered faintly. Earth was yellow in color, similar in hue to sand. Water was of a silvery blue tinge, and its form moved like the waves of the element. Air was white, tinged with yellow. Light was, unsurprisingly, pure light. Darkness was similarly colored based on its nature. Life was green, and death was a mixture of blackness and purple, tinged like rot. Time was a silvery gray color. Fate was a collection of golden strands, winding around each other to infinity. Order was dark blue. Finally, chaos was a mixture of all the other colors, flickering like a rainbow. And then, from his own experiences, he knew that the void was purple. Judging by the concentrations that he could see, some of the elements were rarer than the others. A lot of the weapons had the respective hues of the natural sphere of elements around them, but far fewer had ones from the other elements. Out of the 24 or so weapons that were already placed on the wall, none of them had any imbuements from the elements of fate, time, order or chaos. Those were likely the rarest elements among elemental practitioners, with only the void being rarer. From his readings, he knew that was because they were a lot harder to use than the other elements. Time required a great knowledge of relativity to utilize effectively, and one would have to be able to adjust to changing time scales as they fought. Fate was an element that had its own downsides, as the users were bound by the fates that they observed. Order tended to suborn the will of the caster to propagating absolute law in the world. Chaos did the opposite. Chaos practitioners who did not possess control over their elements were generally hunted down by the authorities wherever they were. No city ruler wanted the equivalent of a loose nuke wandering around their city. A chaos practitioner could summon power far beyond their means, but they would have no control over it. Because of this, anyone with a chaos affinity would either hide it, or die early. However, Jonathan knew that all of the elements were potentially useful, and if not for his true affinity, he would have tried to learn how to use them. The void was a far more potent mistress however, and Jonathan would remain faithful. Next up on his impromptu tour were the barracks, where the guards of the city dwelled. He hopped down from the wall, landing on the street with a muffled thump, and then was off, racing towards the nearest barracks. Over the last month or so, the city had grown sufficiently that there were enough guards to fill multiple barracks with, rather than just one. The nearest one was located next to the wall, and Jonathan could hear the noises of people practicing within. It was emptier than it would have been usually, given that some of the guards were out leveling in the wasteland, but there were still at least 40 city guards inside of the building. For some reason, most of them used spears, with hardly any other weaponry, or even magical abilities. Perhaps this was because of the weapon's value in troop formations, as opposed to the fighting style of an elite like Jonathan. As he entered, he leaned against the lintel, watching as the guards fought one another. They were certainly skilled, that was for sure, but their strength and speed were lacking. None of them would last a second against a tier 2. The soldiers fought on another without the use of any abilities, simply relying on their martial skill. A lot of the moves that they used seemed to be things that had been drilled into them over time, as Jonathan saw a lot of repeated attacks going on across the room. A lot of those aforementioned attacks seemed to be more geared towards supporting another fighter than anything else. From an over-the-shoulder thrust that looked to be aimed at poking through a hole in a defensive line, to a series of sharp, probing jabs that would be more effective on a bustling battlefield than in a training room. A higher-level guard kept watch over the garrison, one of the guards that Jonathan had granted access to the mana magnet array. Upon seeing Jonathan, the man saluted, and the mock battle came to a halt. "Welcome, faction leader." The man barked out, with the other soldiers joining in. Jonathan nodded in response, and studied the room. The floor was covered in a rough woven mat, one that would not provide much in the way of comfort if somebody fell, or more likely, was pushed into the ground. The walls were bare save for a few weapon racks, and other than that, it was basically a shell of a building. A hallway led out into a sleeping area in the back of the building, but that was separate from the rest of the place. There were only a few beds in there, as most people that were at the guards level only had to sleep every few weeks or so. The guards quickly got back to sparring a moment later, paying Jonathan no heed. He scanned the room a moment later, finding that most of them were between level 50 and 60. The leader was level 81, which was very impressive, given how little time he had been out here. However, a steady diet of powerful monsters would do that to a man. Jonathan saw that there was nothing more he could do here, and left, heading out into the street. They were lower level than he would have liked, but there were other ways of evening the odds. The inklings of a plan, one involving the Uthraki, was coming into his mind. It would be difficult to pull off, given the limitations of the token, but it could possibly work. Jonathan knew more about the lore of Tartarus now, and he knew that Granath had greatly wronged the inhabitants of that realm by leaving. Perhaps he could use that to his advantage. He wanted to confer with Edgar about his idea first. As he walked, the plan started to crystallize in his mind, the benefit of having high intelligence. Although he was not actually smarter than before, at least in terms of knowledge, he was able to use his intelligence to a far greater extent than before. His mind was unfogged by confusion, and he could concentrate on things that would have caused the old Jonathan to throw up his hands in dismay. He was a different man now, in many ways. Jonathan headed on a roundabout path through the city, going towards the central barracks, where Edgar was sure to be. He had taken to training with his girlfriend in the martial disciplines, after she had told him of their use. Mainly it was because he was quite infatuated with her, which anyone could see, but he pretended that it was because of its usefulness to his survivability. By the time Jonathan had reached the center of the city, where the barracks were, he had formed a plan in his mind. However, he still needed Edgar's help in refining it. Walking in the door, he spotted Edgar sparring with Eva, the woman seeming to hold back as she fought. Edgar was not very good at using a spear, and it was showing, but he valiantly fought on, fumbling through the blocks and parries. Jonathan did not laugh however, as he was no better at using the unfamiliar weapon. Although his dexterity would allow him to muddle through a fight, if it was removed, he would probably be worse than Edgar was. Using his fists just seemed more natural to him, because he had greater control over them than any weapon. Jonathan cleared his throat as he entered, and Edgar looked up. "Edgar! I have something that I want to run by you," Jonathan called out. "What is it?" "Come with me." Edgar sighed and extricated himself from his battle, heading away from Eva. The woman flashed Jonathan a glare, and he instinctively cringed. The woman glared at him for a few seconds, and then went back to training. Gulping, Jonathan led Edgar out of the room. He had always wondered why in stories powerful fighters would find themselves quailing before the wrath of women. He had assumed that it was just a plot device, added for the purpose of levity, but it was all too real. Some habits just died hard. As the two friends left the barracks, Jonathan began to explain his plan. He had led Edgar away from the barracks in case there were any spies. There were bound to be some in this city. I surveyed the city earlier, and I have to say, I am not very optimistic about our chances. However, I had an idea. It might be foolish in the extreme, but I can't think of anything else. What is it? Edgar asked, seeming a little annoyed at having been separated from Eva. So, you remember that watchtower in Tartarus? There was that letter that spoke about how Granath had abandoned the Dothraki, leaving them to ruin. I was thinking that we could pit them against each other. That's a brilliant idea. How do you plan to do it though? That's what I was stuck on. The challenges to enacting Jonathan's plan were manifold, and the risks were as well. The Dothraki would pose a danger to the city if they were unleashed, as unless the forces of Granath were right there, it would be difficult to harness their power. The only way that Jonathan could think of this working was if he told the Dothraki about the plan. However, that had even more risks inherent. In addition, he would only ever be able to get a few over from Tartarus into this world, as the token only worked once a day. However, it was the best idea that he had. Edgar had slowly warmed to the notion, and the two men eventually hashed out a tentative plan. Jonathan would enter Tartarus, and make his way to a previously unexplored village, where he would attempt to make contact with the villagers. If everything went south, he would flee and leave, but there was a chance that he could negotiate his way towards a deal if he played his cards right. It was a long shot, but the only other thing that Jonathan could really do, that only he could do. All of the other defenses were being handled by the citizens, and Jonathan needed something to do to contribute. This was his best option. He had little preparation to do for this, save for leaving the city environs, and he simply teleported into Tartarus when he was ready, leaving Edgar behind. He had summoned some of the stronger fighters to guard his teleportation spot, just in case the Dothraki visitor became violent. That was assuming that he managed to succeed, of course. The molten world of Tartarus sprang into being a moment later, greeting him with a blast of searing air. He took a deep breath, and then started towards the nearest village. He avoided the village where he had led the eel through, as he doubted that they would be very enamored with his presence. Instead, he headed for one a few dozen miles away, one that had not yet enjoyed the pleasure of his company. As his feet flashed across the volcanic rock, he weaved his way through the various lava flows and environmental hazards, covering miles every minute. Some time later, he arrived at his destination, coming to a screeching halt outside the village. It looked much the same as the other ones that he had seen, with a crude array of stone huts. Dothraki milled around within the village, and a few hunting parties were dispatched every now and again. For this to work, Jonathan would need to find their leader. Otherwise he would be simply mobbed. Jonathan snuck into the village, using his advanced dexterity and some of his more complicated void abilities to mask his presence. It was not a skill, per se, but he could use the void's conceptual power to eat up the sound of his movements, as sound was just a form of energy. The void was hungry for everything. With this in action, Jonathan managed to make his way deep into the village, eventually coming face to face with a hut that clearly belonged to the leader of the tribe. A massive, bleached skull hung over the door frame, and the house was slightly larger than the others. Jonathan steeled himself, and then knocked on the door. It flew open a movement later, almost taking his head off. "What?" A gruff voice called out from inside. "I told you lot not to disturb me. Do I need to come out and lop off a few heads again?" Jonathan simply knocked again, this time on the hut. There was a muffled curse, and a hulking brute of an Dothraki barged out the door, hefting a large sword. He paused upon seeing Jonathan, and regarded him with a look of curiosity. "What are you supposed to be then?" Unlike the normal Dothraki, this one seemed not to have as much pent-up hostility. Rather than instantly attack Jonathan, he actually seemed curious. "I am the man who can help you get your revenge against Granath," Jonathan said. The Dothraki leader snarled, and whipped his sword down, nearly splitting Jonathan in half. "Liar!" he bellowed, reversing the sword strike. "I'm not lying. Jonathan shouted as he ducked. "I come from another world. I can transport you there." The Dothraki only laughed bitterly and kept attacking. "If you can beat me, runt, then perhaps I will listen to you. There is no place for weaklings here." It was better than nothing, and Jonathan seized upon the opportunity. He imbued his fist with power and rammed it into the Dothraki's gut, sending the massive man stumbling backwards. However, the fighter was a lot higher level than Jonathan, and the strike did only superficial damage to his reddish skin. The sword came whistling down a moment later, and Jonathan hurriedly parried it with his gauntlet, wincing in pain. There was a lot of force behind that strike. The Dothraki grinned through stained fangs, and ramped up the speed, massive muscles bulging and stretching as he did so. Jonathan cursed loudly and flitted backwards with the use of his stamina redirection ability as a particularly deadly sword stroke came down right where he had been standing. The Dothraki kept control over his weapon, not letting it touch the ground, and reversed the strike, turning it into a sideways slash. The man was clearly skilled with his weapon, despite appearing to be nothing more than a raging brute. Jonathan felt the wind of its passing, even through his armor, and met the blow with his fist, sending all of his power into it. From his divinity to the conceptual energy of the void, all blended together to strike. A nova of energy erupted from his fist as it swung, and the two strikes clashed in a storm of power and fury, sending tremors racing across the ground. The Dothraki laughed at this, and gave Jonathan a wicked grin. The man started to pulse with angry red light and charged Jonathan, bull-rushing across the distance between them in the blink of an eye, disengaging from the crossed weapons. However, this allowed Jonathan to lash his fully enhanced fist into the base of the other fighter's chin. The Dothraki had been underestimating the amount of strength that he had, judging Jonathan by his earlier strike. However, that was only the barest part of his power. With a roar, he accelerated his fist with his redirection ability, and it rocketed into the Dothraki's head, knocking him off his feet and into the air. Bones snapped and flesh cracked under the onslaught as the attack struck home. There was a moment of silence as the Dothraki fell, and then a crash as he landed next to Jonathan. The fighter rolled over, getting to his feet. With a grunt, he set his jaw back into place, and laughed. "You're putting on a good show, runt. You possess great power for a worm. However, I am only getting started here." Jonathan scoffed and raised his hands, ready to fight. The Dothraki roared in anger, and leaped into the air, his sword glinting in the ambient light. Some of the other villagers had come out after hearing the commotion, and were watching the battle in silence. As the leader came down, Jonathan danced to the side. However, a charge of energy ran up and down the length of the blade as it fell, carrying intense destructive potential. Clearly recognizing this attack, the nearby Dothraki scurried away. The other man screamed as he brought his sword down, not seeming to care that Jonathan was out of the way. As it turned out, it hardly mattered. A blast wave of light and heat erupted from the point of impact, wrecking the nearby houses and blasting Jonathan off of his feet. His bones snapped under the force, and he flew through the air like a missile, his fall only being broken by a nearby house. Behind him was a scene of utter devastation. A 50-foot wide crater stood where a series of huts had been, with the Dothraki leader standing in the middle, his skin flayed off by the force of the blow. However, he was still standing strong. Jonathan on the other hand had been flattened into the ground by the strike, and was somewhat dazed. The bones in his right leg and arm had been snapped by the blast, and the rest of his body was bruised all over. With a snarl of rage, he got to his feet, relying on his superior stats to keep him standing. He could already feel the bones snapping back together, but it would still take some time for him to be back in full fighting form. However, his new ranged skill was perfect for this situation. With a roar, he pumped thousands of points of mana into his void cannon ability, creating a shell of condensed energy that rocketed towards his foe at supersonic speeds. Perhaps if he had been in top condition, the Dothraki could have dodged, but as it was, there was no time. The attack slammed into the man like the fist of a god, blasting him off his feet. There was a crack like thunder as the skill detonated, further widening the crater. When the dust cleared, Jonathan saw the Dothraki lying on the ground a few hundred feet away, out for the count. With mingled curses and grunts, Jonathan made his way towards his fallen foe, waiting for the other man to wake up. The nearby Dothraki regarded him with awe, as they had likely never seen their leader defeated. It wasn't like the man was at the peak of Tier 2 or anything, but he was at least 10 or 15 levels higher than the other Dothraki. By the time that Jonathan had reached the man, the Dothraki was already starting to wake up. "We had a deal," Jonathan said as he approached, ready to smite the fighter out of existence if he proved to be dishonorable. However, the Dothraki simply levered himself to his feet, and sighed. "That we did. I will listen to you." The fact that the man was standing, while half of his body was flayed down the bone was astounding. Perhaps the Dothraki simply felt less pain than other races. The Dothraki lumbered towards a shard of broken rock, and sat down on it. Jonathan found another one, and sat too. "You claim that you can deliver vengeance upon the betrayer. How do you plan to do that?" The Dothraki said, his voice a lot calmer than before. His manner of speaking was at odds with his appearance, but Jonathan supposed that the Dothraki were simply another sapient race like all the others. They just looked more intimidating. "I possess the ability to leave and enter this world, while bringing one person with me. I wanted to propose that you join me, and help my city fight Granath's forces," Jonathan replied, choosing his words carefully. He did not want to project a sense that he was ordering the other man around. "Interesting. What about the mana density? I remember that the elders spoke of a desert of power in the outside world, one where an initiate could not manifest his full power." "Initiate?" Jonathan asked, confused. "What your kind call Tier 2. We rank them by orders of 10, but there is little call for any above Tier 2 in this realm." "Oh. Well, I have a solution for that, but only if you agree to fight alongside me, without betraying my people," Jonathan replied. "You insult my honor," the Dothraki said, spitting to the side. "But I suppose that is fair. After all, there is no bond between us. My name is Husher, son of Alker." "My name is Jonathan," he said. "Jonathan Harlow." The Dothraki leader, Husher, sat back as he contemplated Jonathan's words. Although it was tempting to think of him as a mere brute, incapable of any advanced reasoning, Jonathan knew that would be a mistake. A calculating mind existed behind that barbaric facade, and it was one bolstered by the system. A few moments later, Husher responded. "You certainly know how to incentivize one of my race, Jonathan. However, how do I know that you speak the truth? This could all be an elaborate ruse, concocted in order to kill me." "You insult your own strength by saying that," Jonathan replied, knowing the words that would motivate the other man. "Do you really think that I could kill you easily enough to be confident in trapping you? You almost defeated me back there." "Ha! You speak like a true Dothraki. If not for your runty body, you might pass as one of us." Ignoring Husher's predilection for calling him a runt, Jonathan simply laughed. He could tell that he had scored some points with the other man by using his own logic. Now that the Dothraki had stopped fighting, the other villagers had left the scene, sensing that negotiations were underway. None of the bloodthirsty demon-like beings wanted anything to do with that. "I will go with you. However, if there is any double-dealing, you will be the first to fall. As well as that, I want you to give me the artifact, or whatever it is that allows you to resist the mana desert of the outside world." The Dothraki leader snorted as if in derision of the thought that Jonathan would dare to defy him, and then eyed him up, waiting for his answer. "That is agreeable," Jonathan replied, beginning to channel his divinity, ready to create the runic array. He laid one hand on the Dothraki's arm, trying to obfuscate what he was doing. It was better to be safe than sorry. Muttering nonsense under his breath, he extended small tendrils of mana from his palm, drawing the runic pattern into the skin of the other man. As he worked, his charge did not make a noise, simply gazing at the work in curiosity. A few minutes later, it was done, and Jonathan withdrew his hand. Husher looked down at the runic array with a curious gaze, and flexed the arm that it was on, as if he could tell the difference with the movements of his muscles. He was evidently satisfied with the array, as he gave Jonathan a small bow of gratitude. "Many thanks to you for this, Jonathan of the Harlow tribe. I can sense that you told the truth. Now, on to the other world." Jonathan nodded, ignoring the glances from the few lurking villagers that still remained around them, and reached out, holding the token in his hand. As Husher grasped it, they winked out of existence, appearing outside of the city walls, just as Jonathan had planned. It was unlikely at this point that his new, if very tentative, ally would betray him at this stage, but it was wiser to prepare for any eventuality. As Husher became acclimated to the ash heaps, Jonathan could see the demonic man's beady eyes studying everything around him with an intelligence that belied his brutish form. "What is that strange light in the sky? What manner of monster is that?" Husher asked in thinly veiled awe. Jonathan followed his gaze, and realized that the man was looking at the sun. The flaming orb of light was not the same as the sun that Jonathan was used to, as it was quite a bit dimmer, but it was still majestic, especially so to a man who had never seen its like before. "That's the sun. It's a bit hard to explain, but it basically is a large ball of flaming gas that provides light for this world. Unlike Tartarus, there is little ambient light from lava or other similar sources. It is quite cold here," Husher admitted. "How do you and your people live so far away from the warming embrace of the Primal One?" "I doubt I could explain it in a satisfactory manner," Jonathan said, not knowing what the Primal One was. It was likely some sort of earth god, or idolatry figure of the Uthraki, but he was wary of offending Husher. The man was essential to the survival of the city. "No matter. Where are your blood sworn?" Husher replied, looking at the city. "If you mean my followers, they are inside the city walls. I would prefer it if you remained out here, however. You are quite an imposing specimen. Some of the weaker members of the city might view you as a threat." "Ha!" Husher bellowed happily. "I would have it no other way." Jonathan nodded, calculating furiously within his head. Husher was quite an enigmatic figure, as far as he could tell, and certainly different than he had been expecting. There was certainly a brutish patina, but also intelligence as well. Jonathan was still influenced by the stereotypes of the old world, and he almost instinctively equated size and strength with a commensurate lack of intelligence. However, in this world, nobody who had made it to Tier 2 was in any way stupid, even if they had not allocated a single point to intelligence. Husher seemed content to study the world around him as Jonathan deliberated, and a few minutes later, Edgar and Eva came over the wall, both of them floating under the influence of the former's mastery over the air. Both of them looked wary of Jonathan's brutish companion, and he could sense the tensions rising as they alighted on the ground. "Is he safe?" Edgar asked almost immediately, glaring at Husher like he was trying to eviscerate the man with sheer force of will. Husher met the gaze evenly, letting out a low growl from deep within his massive body. He did not seem amused. "He has a name, Runt," Husher replied. "I am Husher, the son of Alker. You would do well to remember that." Edgar snarled and summoned a swirling nexus of wind to his hand. Sensing that things might become violent soon, especially considering the light that was beginning to swirl around Eva's spear, Jonathan decided to act. His aura burst out of him, swirling like a nebula of purple energy. It only was out for a second, but it was enough to cut through the aggression like a knife. Enough. If Granath could see this, he would be ecstatic. Why bother killing us when we can just do it ourselves? Slightly mollified, Edgar and Eva nodded. Jonathan noticed that Husher only nodded after the others had done so. "We seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot," Eva interjected, loosening her grip on her spear. "You have the appearance of a monster, and the power to destroy this city. It is natural that we are wary." Husher seemed to brighten up at what he saw as flattery, and nodded. The tension dissipated somewhat, but it was still there, lurking beneath the surface of the situation. It would come back in a heartbeat if anything was done to engender such a response. Sighing in relief, Jonathan took charge of the meeting, wanting to head off any other possible fights that might take place. Husher is very high level for this part of the world, and with the addition of my mana recycling array, he is at peak strength. Although Granath is league stronger, he does not possess this advantage, and neither do his soldiers. Because of this, Husher is worth hundreds of fighters all on his own. Just how strong are you? Edgar asked, curiosity replacing his open suspicion. I am currently level 174, Husher replied. My strength is, or at least I would like to believe, higher than average for that rank. My village has survived for many years against the encroaching monsters of Tartarus, and I am half of the reason. The man seemed not to realize how much he was bragging about his strength. Perhaps the Uthraki were simply more straightforward in such matters, omitting social niceties in favor of efficiency. That is quite some power, Edgar replied, searching for the right words. I look forward to seeing what you can do against our enemies. So do I. So do I, Husher responded. With those words, the conversation was over, and Edgar made his way back towards the city. Eva lingered a bit longer, still seeming slightly apprehensive about Husher, but after 15 minutes of nothing happening, save for a vaguely pleasant conversation about life in Tartarus, she left as well. Well, as you can see, there is a reason for you to remain out here. Do you require lodging? Jonathan asked his companion, having to tilt his head back to look him in the eyes. What little I need, I can create for myself. The fiery blood of the Primal One resides within me, and the earth is my brother. The magma, my sister. Husher raised one hand, and energy started to swirl around it, yellow power mixed with streaks of red. Around him, the ash started to bubble and heat up, and the rocks that were strewn across it liquefied. With a bubbling hiss, they started to coalesce into a dome, rising up until they stood over Husher's head. A few minutes later, he was left with a crude hut, with a single window and a door. Seeing the potential of this ability, Jonathan asked a question. How much earth can you manipulate in that manner? About 10 times this amount, but it would bottom out. My elemental energy and mana. Why? Would you be able to fortify this plane against any invaders? Husher looked around himself, taking in the flat landscape that stretched out from the base of the city wall, marred by the trench that the mages had dug. He nodded. Without another word, the man raised his arms high above his head, summoning larger amounts of energy than before. The earth shook slightly as his will was exerted upon the world, and it started to rise up. In order to save energy, he took the earth from long strips of land, creating trenches that extended in front of the walls. When all was said and done, about 100 feet of stone, 15 feet high and about 3 thick, spread across the plain. It was nothing compared to the main wall, but it could be added to over time. It seemed that Husher would be even more valuable than Jonathan had thought. With a smile, he left the towering hulk of a man, heading back towards the city. It was time to continue adding his more personal touches to the defenses. He had already created a few layers of runic arrays, but he had other configurations that he wanted to try. Nothing close to another array, but enough. His rune of consumption was volatile, but it had an upper limit of mana that it could ingest. That upper limit was generally higher than that of most beings in this world, and it had been used in the past as a trap. Starting in the middle, he began to add clusters of the runes in between the other traps. By the time he was done, a few hours later, the wall looked like it was surrounded by a god sketch of some abstract scene, constructed out of light. However, all Jonathan could think of was Granath's overwhelming might, which put quite a damper on his pride. With nothing more to do on the outside of the city, Jonathan headed in. He had done all he could in terms of his runic abilities, the one thing that put him head and shoulders above the other defensive crafters. Now it was time to hone his other skills. Those that would help him in battle. With what was likely less than a week left until the city was besieged, Jonathan planned out every day from that point on. He was not so naive as to believe that the other Ithraki leaders would flock to his cause like Husher had. Some of them might come, but most would simply try to kill him. He would have to balance out his need for allies with his own safety. With about 16 hours left until his token recharged, Jonathan trained. And trained. And trained. Working his highly durable body to the bone was difficult, but not impossible. Using his full speed and power with every strike and technique that was part of his martial style allowed him to act as if he was in a pitched battle. The air seemed to thrum as his powerful strikes tore through it. It was getting to the point where he was creating tiny vacuums with every punch that tugged on the dust around him. Useless in a normal fight, but something that would possibly help him if he gained more power. Perhaps after his second or third threshold in strength. That was coming closer and closer the more power he gained, and soon he would be able to get there with his stockpile of free points. Before the upcoming battle, he would allocate all of his free points. There was no need to hold back for something like this. However, that time was not yet to come. As he worked through his martial abilities, Jonathan concentrated on his more mystical powers. He could contemplate his elemental energy as he worked, partitioning his mind to work on multiple things at once. His high intelligence was the main reason behind this. He also was beginning to form an idea of just how the various stats really worked. The physical ones were straightforward to the extreme, except for constitution. Strength increased physical strength. Dexterity increased speed and reaction time. Resilience increased the overall durability of his body. However, constitution was less clear. It seemed to do the same thing as resilience, at least nominally, but it manifested itself in a different way. Constitution did nothing for durability. Jonathan suspected that if he had his current constitution score, but a 10 or so in resilience, even a glancing blow from a similarly leveled being would severely injure him. It seemed that the two stats had a multiplicative effect. There was his nominal health, and then a secondary health bar that was likely created by the confluence of those stats. This created a level of durability beyond what was written on his stat sheet. He could tell that he was nowhere near fully comprehending how this all worked, so he moved on to the mental stats. Intelligence had two functions. It increased the processing speed of his brain, and increased his mana reserves. The former of the increases was not as noticeable as one might think. It did not increase his functional intelligence anything beyond what he already knew. He did not magically have the ability to comprehend rocket science or anything. Rather, it seemed to mesh somewhat with his other stats in battle, allowing him to keep up with the rapid pace of conflict. On the other hand, wisdom was a lot more inscrutable. It seemed to influence his mana regeneration rate, but seeing as strength was the only stat that corresponded with his stamina, it did not really fit. Then an epiphany hit like a bolt of lightning from above. What if his stats were all paired? He had 3 stats that increased his resource pools, and 3 that did not. What if the other ones all increased his regeneration rate? Dexterity for strength, resilience for constitution, and wisdom for intelligence. It all made sense now. Jonathan had solved part of the mystery of how his stats worked. Although it seemed mostly useless now, it might come in handy later. With that avenue of inquiry over, Jonathan slipped back into mindless training, whiling away the hours until he could depart for Tartarus. There was no increase in his skill, but such increases only came with time. He had to be patient. By the time he was done, he was itching for a change in scenery, and when the subtle mental hint that his token had recharged entered his psyche, he pulled it out and used it. He could have brought Edgar along, but for a mission like this, more people would have made it harder. Besides, that would require him to strand the other man in Tartarus, as the token could only take one additional person with it. With a whoosh, he was transported to the subterranean hellscape of Tartarus, exiting outside of the village where he had met Husher. The nearby Uthraki snarled upon seeing the unexpected intruder, but then seemed to recognize him, and stopped. One of them stepped forward, a grizzled, bearded Dothraki who was far older than the others. "Where did you bring our leader?" he asked, peering at Jonathan through rheumy eyes. Either he was extremely old, or was a mage of some sort. High stats should have prevented such things. "Back to my world. He is safe for now. I warn you, if something has happened to Chief Husher, you will not survive the wrath of our people," the old man said, mustering conviction that belied his appearance. "He is integral to my plans. Why would I betray him?" Jonathan said, scoffing. He had to make it look like he was a lot more confident than he was. He was surrounded by beings that drastically outleveled him, after all. He could easily dispatch one or even a few of them, but all of them together. There was no chance. He would have to run, and then waste a token charge. Evidently satisfied, the Dothraki walked away, leaving him in peace. Jonathan shook his head, and walked off. He would need to find another village for the next stage of his plan. The plain of smooth volcanic rock, interspersed with lava flows and small hills, extended out into the horizon, providing Jonathan with little guidance, and even less direction. He would need to wander until he could find another village, it seemed. Before, he had scouted the land from the top of a hill, but now that he was on the plain, he was not sure where exactly the nearest village was from here. It wasn't that they were especially distant from one another, with each village only being a few dozen miles apart, or even less in some cases. Rather, it was quite difficult to spot the relatively tiny settlements amid the cavernous expanse of Tartarus. As he wandered, he attracted the attention of various monsters of the realm, ranging from elementals to scaly beasts that crawled out of the lava. The first encounter was with a twisting pillar of flame that hissed across the ground, turning the rock that it touched to a smooth, glassy substance. It looked like a fire tornado, with a vaguely anthropomorphic head, made so by a pair of glowing red eyes, made out of condensed fire. As it moved, it created an unearthly howling noise, as the air around it was burnt away to sustain its infernal heat. The creature seemed to be little more than a simple automaton, only capable of chasing its prey. However, as it possessed little to no weight, it could move quite rapidly, which meant that Jonathan had to stand and fight. Physical attacks were useless against a creature like this, which meant that he would need to use his energy abilities. The creature whipped forwards, sending a tendril of fire rocketing in from the left. Jonathan ducked the blow, and responded with a swift punch, empowered by the energy of the void. It was only a minimal amount, in order to test the strength of his enemy. His fist made contact with the flame, sending its charge of energy into the elemental. Where it struck, a disk of dark energy shot out, consuming the flame like a bucket of water had been dropped on it. The elemental severed the tendril at the root, causing the tentacle of flame to be eaten up completely by Jonathan's hungry elemental energy. He smiled. At this, it looked like his attacks were anathema to pure energy beings. He moved in, rocketing forwards with a quick application of his stamina redirection ability. Leaving twin craters from his sheer speed, he hurtled towards the elemental, his fist blazing with light. A whip of flame slashed across his side, leaving burns down his abdomen, but he tanked the hit in order to get a more advantageous position. His fist sunk into the center of the elemental, blasting out a portion of its incorporeal form into the ether. A shockwave of darkness spread outwards, which the monster barely sequestered in time. Despite its vulnerability on account of its form, the creature also had natural advantages that made this fight not entirely trivial. It could separate its form in any way that it wanted, only limited by its reaction time. As Jonathan drew back, the air started to heat up, as the monster unleashed its full heat. Waves of broiling heat spread out from the creature, and a moment later, the air ignited as the oxygen burst into flame. A dome of fire rocketed outwards from the elemental, and picked Jonathan off his feet, blasting his skin with pure heat. Blisters formed over this front, his armor doing little to protect him from the heat. Such were the weaknesses of metal armor. Metal armor was great at redirecting force, but it acted like an oven if enough heat was pumped into it, roasting its wearer alive. However, Jonathan was tougher than that. He caught himself a few dozen feet away, and raised one hand, sending a pulse of void light outwards. His void cannon skill went off with a bang, and the lance of energy tore through the elemental a moment later, ripping its form in two. An explosion of energy finished the job, blasting the monster into a few embers drifting in the air. Essence rushed into Jonathan, taking him up a level to 124. One of those elites came into his path about 10 minutes later, a massive creature that looked like a red-scaled armadillo. Its plated exterior blazed with a fiery light, and its eyes seemed to glow from the inside. Spikes graced its form, wicked, jagged protuberances that were longer than Jonathan's hand. It spotted him a moment later, and a grating noise erupted from its mouth, perhaps the creature's version of laughter. It leaped up into the air and then curled into a ball, bringing its scales in tight to its body. Boosters of flame erupted from its back and it started rolling towards him, building up speed as it went. If not for the sheer size of the monster, it would have been quite comical. If it hit him, it would pulp him against the rocks. He dove out of the way, using his stamina abilities to carry him to a safe distance. It ate away a good chunk of his reserves, but upon seeing the monster turn on a dime, almost hitting him, it proved to be worth it. The creature flashed by, illuminated by the jets of flame that propelled it, and Jonathan had a brief moment to plan. Seizing control of his mana and elemental energy, he weaved together a powerful void cannon, sending it racing after the creature. With a dull thump, it was knocked off its feet, a few scales blasted off its form. However, it was quite tough, and the attack did little more than cause it to drop its spherical shape. The creature went back on all fours and whipped around, pouncing at Jonathan with all its claws extended. They looked like they had been made for digging, but could also be used to rend flesh and bone just as easily as rock. Heat billowed off the monster in waves, and Jonathan was forced to bear it, even as it stung his already burnt skin. Although he could have just as easily used his left hand, he still preferred using his right one. Seeing as he had perfect ambidexterity, he did not need to practice with his offhand. The monster reared onto its hind legs, snarling at him. However, it seemed to be confident in its power, and it sent one paw hurtling upwards to meet his strike. Metal-clad fist met claw, and the two attacks struggled against one another in the air. However, Jonathan's energy pulsed past the physical boundaries of his strike, and as the monster had no energy to match it, it rippled down the creature's arm. With a series of crackling pops, its bones shattered, causing the limb to crumple under Jonathan's onslaught. It was propelled into the ground, letting out a screech of pain as it landed. The monster curled up into a ball a moment later, starting to build up speed once more. This time, Jonathan was too close to easily dodge. One of the spikes slammed into his armor as it passed, leaving a scratch on the armor, and breaking his arm. With a hiss of pain, he rolled to the side, avoiding further damage. This was a very annoying monster to fight as a melee fighter. His magical skills were powerful, but only a mage who had specialized in their craft from the very beginning would have been able to hurt this creature severely with sheer magical might. He still used his other skills to the best of his ability however, and another void cannon slammed into the patch of torn scales that the first one left. It was only a glancing blow, but because of the damage already dealt to the area, it managed to draw blood. Jonathan tried to send off another one, but the creature whirled around in time to face him, and rolled his way. With a muttered curse, Jonathan was forced to throw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the creature's attack. He had heard it, and it had a clear preference on which side it places its weight, but he doubted that it would leave its ball form from now on. He wondered how it was able to see him, but that was probably a question best left for later. The monster rolled his way yet again, but as it moved, Jonathan realized that there was a slight seam where both sides of its body met. Within that seam was a small portal to its more vulnerable insides. It would be hard to hit, but ultimately worth it. As the creature rolled in for another strike, Jonathan extended his mana out from his left hand in a thin blade of energy, gathering power in his other hand as he did so. The armadillo rolled in, distracted by the energy gathered around the right gauntlet. However, that allowed Jonathan to strike. With a grunt, he drove the energy blade into the thin crack as it came into view, stabbing it through the head. With a roar, the creature faltered, and Jonathan stabbed deeper, twisting the blade as it went. The monster barreled into him, crushing him into the ground. However, his blade eventually found the monster's brain, killing it. Essence entered him, but not enough to gain another level. He lay there for a moment, and let his skin knit back together somewhat. When he felt that he was up for movement again, he got to his feet, and continued on his way, leaving the corpse of the monster behind him. Then he paused. The scales of the armadillo had been incredibly tough, and they seemed like they would be great crafting materials. What if he brought them back to the city with him? He had forgotten that everything in this place was tier 2, which meant that it would be beneficial to his city. Shaking his head at his earlier stupidity, Jonathan raced back to the corpse, and began to tear off scales. Now that the monster was dead, it was marginally easier for him to do so, as it did not resist. Still, it was quite hard to tear the incredibly durable scales away. 30 minutes later, he had a small pile of the dark plates of keratin lying on the ground next to him. That would be enough for now. He quickly shoveled them into his storage device, and was back on his way. No more monsters bothered him overly on the way to the next village, as he was covered in the blood of the armadillo-like creature, which acted as a testament to his power. By the time he eventually spotted a village, from the top of a small hill, he was getting tired of trekking. This village was a bit larger than the others that he had seen, almost looking like a small town. There was a rocky palisade around the village, not cohesive enough to be called a proper wall. Jonathan watched the village from a distance, trying to gauge how many inhabitants it had. It was certainly more populated than the last village was, and there were over 100 houses in it, if they could really be called that. In addition, at the center of the village, there was a larger building that almost looked like it was imitating a city hall. It was still crudely built, made out of the local rock, in a fashion that Jonathan now recognized as elemental manipulation. The walls were likely made from the same process as well. Because he had no way of proving that he meant the village no harm, he would need to sneak past the weaker members of the village and get to the leader. His ploy had worked the last time, but that had been a matter of pure luck. Husher had barely believed him, and it had taken a duel to prove his might. If the size of this village was anything to go by, its leader was likely even more powerful. Jonathan quickly realized that he was trying to make up excuses so as to not enter, and he forced himself from his hiding spot. The village had few guards, likely the result of hubris on their part. After all, few monsters would attack such a high-leveled settlement. Jonathan could only imagine what the cities that he had seen in the distance would be like. Perhaps there would be fighters near the level of Granath there. However, those cities were thousands of miles away, and not entirely important as of now. Jonathan snuck down towards the city, watching out for any sentries. Keeping his profile low, he used his dark armor to blend in somewhat with the rock. He knew that it would do little to fool such high-leveled guards if they looked directly at him, but he was counting on the fact that they were not especially well trained. Using this method, he was able to reach the palisade wall within a few minutes, using the nearest stone spike as a hiding place. He remained there for a few moments, and then slunk around, entering the city. The palisade was likely there to inhibit the progress of larger monsters, the main inhabitants of these lands, but to Jonathan, it was like he was simply walking through a door. Once he was inside the town, he found himself on a smooth road, compacted from the rock around him. It led to the center of the city, and a few Uthraki patrolled its length. Jonathan darted into a space between two huts, getting out of sight before he was noticed. However, the guards seemed to be in a preset patrol pattern, and would therefore be difficult to sneak by. There were other roads around the city, but they likely had the same issue. This would take some time. Over the next 30 minutes, Jonathan managed to flit his way between the next 6 or 7 houses, using brief moments of blindness for the guards to make his way unseen. There was a moment in their patrols when they were facing the other way at the same time, and he was able to use that to evade their notice. Eventually, he reached the area that they were patrolling, and realized that he would have to fight them to get past. He did not want to kill them, as that would probably render his quest here impossible. Instead, as one of the guards turned, Jonathan leaped out of the shadows and brought his elbow down on the man's head, using his momentum to slam it down. With a groan, the Dothraki collapsed, unconscious. The other 2 guards whirled around, leveling their spears at Jonathan. Snarling, they charged. Jonathan weaved through the sudden onslaught of spear tips, using his fist to slap aside the blows. The Dothraki were fighting to kill, but he merely wanted to incapacitate them, which made his job a lot harder. A few moments later, he saw his opportunity, and grabbed the spear out of the air, yanking on the end. The wielder stumbled into the path of the other Dothraki, and for a few seconds, the 2 Dothraki were disorientated. Jonathan raced towards them like a wraith and slammed both fists into their heads, sending them to the ground. Making sure that he hadn't been spotted, he kept going, heading for the leader's hut. By the time he had reached the building, he was starting to get nervous. What if this Dothraki was powerful enough to kill him? It was certainly a possibility. However, Jonathan had come too far to let fear rule him. Instead, he knocked on the door. "What is it?" A gruff, but oddly feminine voice called out. Jonathan had not seen a female Dothraki before, either because they were rare, or because there was little difference between the genders in that species. The door opened a moment later, revealing an Dothraki that looked quite different from what he had been expecting. Where the Dothraki leaders from the previous villages had stood head and shoulders over their kin, this one was about the same height as the other villagers, if not shorter. With that difference, Jonathan came to the conclusion that this one was a female Dothraki. The woman stared him up and down for a fraction of a second, and then without warning, attacked.